The word I'm looking for. Pick 1. Carry On, Wayward Son by TinyButFierce. Chapter 1. In a small room at the UN headquarters in New York, a group of people sat on other sides of a long table. One spy, one super soldier, one flyer, and one magic user sat across from a UN official, the operator of the war machine armor, and one genius. The only person to speak for a long time was the UN official, outlining the terms for the former fugitive's house arrest and responsibilities. The genius stared out the window at the river, and the former fugitives took cursory glances at him. The UN worker continued to speak. Your rooms at the compound have been prepared for you to return as long as you sign the accords and agree to the terms listed within the document. As you know, your two teammates, Clint Barton and Scott Lang, signed similar documents and are with their families at the present moment. As none of you have families to be under house arrest with, the compound will function as your location at this time. Steve spoke up. We'd all be happy to go home, isn't that right, Tony? The genius snorted and looked at the super soldier. I wasn't the one who took your home. You did that yourself. Steve continued. It's our home. You live there too. Rhodey stifled a laugh, and Tony grinned. Oh, I don't live there. I'm nice and comfortable at Stark Tower. We decided not to sell. Natasha narrowed her eyes. If you're not going to live with us, why are you and Rhodes here? Oh, the UN forced me to be here. They wanted someone who could keep you under control. And Rhodes? He was bored and wanted some entertainment. The UN official cleared her throat. If we could get back to the matter at hand. All of the others calmed down and went back to resolutely ignoring each other, preferring to scan their eyes over paper than create another argument. Pony and Rhodey spoke to each other quietly, too low to pick up. The others tapped their pens on the table and sighed, wishing that they didn't have to read complicated legal documents. Steve pushed back his chair slowly and looked up at the four on the other side of the room. They all looked back. The super soldier put down his pen. It says here that equipment will be provided by the UN, and we have to arrange expenses for that ourselves. The official responded. That would be correct. All of you will have a UN liaison to help with such things as equipment and other expenses. Wanda scoffed. Expenses? Shouldn't Stark be paying for this stuff? Tony laughed, and the UN official continued. Dr. Stark is under no contract to provide you with equipment or funds. The UN is your contact for such things, not Dr. Stark. You are not his responsibility. Steve stood up and placed both his hands on the table, ready to start a verbal battle, until suddenly, out of nowhere, the phone started to ring. Carry On, Wayward Son blasted out of Tony's phone that was sitting on the table. Everyone turned to look at him as he picked up the phone and prepared to answer it. Steve interrupted. I'm positive that nothing could be more important than what is happening right now. Rhodey chuckled. I can guarantee you that the person on the other end of that line is more important. Tony grinned back at Rhodey and picked up the phone. Everyone watched in silence as the genius smiled while listening to whomever was on the other side. Hey, kid. Yeah, no, you're not interrupting anything. Yeah? All right. I can pick you up today. Do you have academic decathlon tonight? Okay, I can pick you up in 30 minutes if that would work for you. That works? Great. You want to work in the labs tonight? I got my hands on some things that I think you would like. All right, see you soon. Tony put the phone in his pocket and stood up to leave. Steve glared at him and walked to the door, standing in front of it and stopping Tony from leaving. The genius paused in front of him and raised an eyebrow. You might want to get out of the way, Rogers. I need to get to Queens in half an hour, and New York traffic is busy this time of day. The super soldier continued to stand in front of the door. You're always late to everything. I don't see why you can't be late to wherever you're going. Besides, who called you anyways? Tony narrowed his eyes and leveled his gaze at the super soldier. 1. I would never purposefully be late for the person I have to pick up soon. 2. His identity is none of your business. I think it should be my business. You're always up for something when you become secretive. You always think the worst of things, don't you? Well, listen to this. The person I have to go get means more to me than any of you. He means more to me than these peace talks right now. I would protect him no matter what happened, and you will not stand in my way. I'm going to ask you one more time to get out of my way before I am forced to make you. The UN would never let you do that. Tony turned to look at the UN official who calmly watched the proceedings. She raised an eyebrow at him and levelled her gaze at the super soldier. You have not signed the accords as of now, and technically this interaction would count as a threat towards Dr. Stark's being in a court of law. Tony grinned at the super soldier. The UN is behind me, and I'm sure that you wouldn't want to go to jail now that you're so close to being home. Roger glared and stepped back from the door. Tony opened it, but paused to look back at the room. Ms. Jones, Rhodey, I'm sure you two can handle it from here. The two nodded at him, and the genius walked out the door. As it closed, the UN official turned back to look at the former fugitives with a smile. Shall we continue? Chapter 2. Shattered metal spread out across the field. Sparking of electronics fizzed all around the group of heroes. Broken doom bots lay dead on the group. Iron Man walked through the destruction, making his way past the other Avengers towards the Quinjet that was waiting to take them all back to the compound for a debriefing. The helmet of the suit retracted when he reached the ship, and he climbed on in silence. Steve sighed and followed the quiet genius. The others trailed after the soldier. Natasha went to the front of the ship and had the Quinjet take off from the battlefield. Sam and Wanda sat at the back of the ship talking quietly, while Steve made his way up to Tony. He stopped right next to the stoic genius and sighed. Tony. Stark turned around and looked at the super soldier with a dazzling pressed smile. Popsicle, what can I do for you? We have to stop this. We? Oh, come on, Stark. Look, I'm sorry. Is that what you wanted to hear? I'm sorry. I did what I thought was right, and you did the same. We can't let this get in between us now. Tony dropped his smile and looked directly at the soldier. Look, Cap, you left me in a frozen wasteland to die. I barely survived. I'm trying my best to get along with you without throwing up whenever I see that horrendous beard. My beard isn't that bad. Uh-huh. Keep telling yourself that. This isn't the point of the conversation. Stop deflecting. I don't deflect. Yes, you do. Every time something happens to you, you lock yourself in your lab and drink. I'm trying to make up with you to prevent you from doing something you'll regret. Tony laughed under his breath. Lock myself in the lab and drink. I'll admit it, I've done that in the past. This time I had people to help me. So stop trying to apologize. I don't think that you honestly believe it. I'm perfectly fine with having a working relationship, but I don't think that we can ever go back to the way things were. I'll keep trying. I know you will. The two lapsed into silence as the Quinjet landed at the compound. Tony sauntered out and made his way to the conference room as the Iron Man suit retracted around him. Rhodey was waiting in the room with the UN liaison. Tony smiled at his best friend. Rhodey, nice commanding on the field there. Rhodes responded, I may not be out there just yet, but that doesn't mean I can't order you around. The genius snarked back. No one orders me around. Two names immediately come to mind. Shut up. They both have you wrapped around their fingers. Natasha chimed in from where she had entered the room. Two people? I thought only Pepper could make him do things. Tony glared at the spy. I don't see why this is something that needs to concern you, Romanov. The spy shrugged. All right. But there was a slight glimmer in her eyes. Whatever it was, she was going to find out eventually. Everyone sat around the table in a configuration similar to their initial talks. Ms. Jones, the UN liaison, spoke up. I think we can all agree this went extremely well. The results of this battle have increased the UN's confidence that you will all be able to work together under the command of Colonel Rhodes. I hope that the rapidness in which the Accords worked to deploy you has settled the concerns of Mr. Rogers and party. Tony snorted. Mr. Rogers, which neighborhood are you from again? Steve looked at Tony in confusion. Brooklyn? I've told you this before. Tony just giggled until Rhodey elbowed him, the colonel smirking as well. Jones glared at the two. I will leave the meeting up to the behest of Colonel Rhodes. He will address any concerns in the cooperation of this group in battle. Rhodes nodded and thanked the liaison, who quickly exited the room. The colonel placed his hands on the table and looked around. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, Tony's phone started blaring Dear Theodosia at full volume. Everyone turned to look as he lifted up his phone to see who was calling. Rhodey looked over his shoulder and laughed. You changed his ringtone to that. Tony glared at the phone. I didn't change it. He must have hacked it. He's trying to get me to take him to Hamilton. Steve looked at Tony, alarmed. Is someone blackmailing you? If they can hack you, we may all be in danger. Tony muttered under his breath. He's always blackmailing me, and picked up the phone. Did you hack into my phone just to change my ringtone? No. Then how? Oh, it was open on the counter. That's disappointing. What? Don't Mr. Stark me. What are you calling for anyways? Uh-huh. Oh yeah, of course I can help with that. What subject? Everyone looked around in confusion at the change of topic. Rhodey just grinned at the expressions of the other Avengers. History. I'm not sure how much help I'll be with that. What topic? The Revolutionary War. Why would I be able to help with... Oh, I see what you're doing. Uh-huh, sure it'll help you. I don't like musicals. Don't technically it's an opera me. So what? Carmen is good. Sam turned around and mouthed the words. Only listens to Carmen? To Natasha, who shrugged and continued to listen to the conversation. All right, fine, I'll take you. Stop screaming, it hurts my ears. Wait, are there other people there? No, absolutely not. I agreed to take you, not your entire posse. Don't care if your girlfriend is scary and wants to go. I don't protest that part. Everyone can see how you stare at her all the time. Uh-huh. You know what? Fine. It's only the three of you. All right, you're welcome. Yeah, see you later. Bye. Tony hung up and put the phone back in his pocket. Natasha raised an eyebrow. I'm assuming that was the second person that you take orders from. I don't take orders from him. He annoys me until I give in. Sounds like blackmail. It's not blackmail. I think we should be told who this person is. Absolutely not. Just as Natasha was about to respond, Steve interrupted. If Tony and Rhodes don't see a problem, I think we can trust them. Everyone stared at the captain until Rhodey shrugged. I see no problem. Then it's all fine. The other Avengers all shot Steve confused glances, which he responded to with steely ones. Tony and Rhodey gave each other a glance that amounted to having a chat later. Rhodey cleared his throat. In that case, I believe that we can begin this debrief. Chapter 3. The cameras lined up in front of the empty stage and the world watched in anticipation. Stark Industries had announced that they had big news to be delivered at a press conference that would be headed by Tony Stark himself. Steve Rogers sat on a couch with Natasha, Wanda, and Sam at the compound. Neither Tony nor Rhodey had told them anything about what was going to be announced, so they were as much in the dark as the public was. Clapping was heard as the man himself walked onto stage and smiled at the crowd and the viewers. He walked up to the podium and removed his signature sunglasses, sliding them into a pocket of his suit. Everyone quieted in anticipation. The best announcements always happened when he thought it right to remove his glasses. He smirked at the waiting crowd and began to speak. I'm sure you are all very excited to hear what I am about to announce. This will be even better for you as I obviously have no cue cards. You all know what happens when I'm left to my own devices. Quiet chuckles echoed through the audience until Stark began to speak again. As many of you know, my father and I never got along. He preferred his job over his wife and child. I swore that I would never follow in his footsteps in that retrospect. After I shut down my father's legacy, the weapons business, most of the stockholders abandoned this company, only for it to begin to thrive again under the command of Pepper Potts. He deserves most of the credit. We all know that I never had any control anyways. Few laughs were heard. Steve turned towards Sam. You think he would just get to the point already? I think he's doing a pretty good job. If this ends up being serious, he might as well throw a few jokes in there. The super soldier glanced at Sam, but quickly looked away after noticing that Sam was trying to pay closer attention to the screen. Natasha watched the proceedings with interest. Tony continued to speak. I have heard many comments recently about what would happen to the company if I was ever heavily injured or killed in my role as Iron Man. I have to admit, I'm not getting any younger. But success of SI is not just because of myself. Scores of brilliant scientists and lawyers and business persons work at the company. The contingencies that were enacted during my stay in Afghanistan would still go through pending the loss of my ability to work with the company. However, there has been an upticking of comments recently that doubt the company's ability to bounce back if I was ever unable to return again. I am here today to quell those rumours. Whispers echoed throughout the room. In the past year or so, I have been training a replacement for myself. I will not be naming him today because of security reasons. I want him to be able to make it through the full extent of his schooling before being subjected to the press, so I ask that you do not search for him. While he is not mine biologically, he has levels of intellect that rival my own, and compassion that I never had. There is no one better that I would name my heir. He has my entire confidence, and I'm sure that he will earn yours. The room was silent for a few seconds, until it finally burst into a chaotic stream of noise, as every reporter yelled questions at the stand. Tony raised his hand. One at a time, people. All right, first up, you in the yellow shirt. Dr. Stark, what information can you tell us about your heir? Tony smiled at the reporter. He can talk for hours without stopping and thinks the original Star Wars movies are old. Sam gasped and turned towards Natasha in shock. Star Wars isn't old. The spy rolled her eyes. More reporters jostled for questions. Dr. Stark, will you continue your role as Iron Man as well as your role at Stark Industries? We have yet to talk about it, but the potential is there. Dr. Stark, what does Miss Potts think of your choice as heir? She thinks he's adorable. Dr. Stark, how did you meet him? A select amount of circumstances that I will not go into further detail at the moment. Question continued along those lines for another half an hour or so, until Tony was finally ushered off stage by the various PR managers, who reiterated the request that the press not attempt to find the heir in question. The Avengers sat in silence on the couch. After the questions stopped coming, Wanda stormed off, uttering about another Stark she has to watch out for. Steve looked in confusion at the TV, wondering why Tony hadn't said anything about it, and Sam left to go browse on Tumblr to check in with the fan base to see if they had figured out who it was yet. Natasha watched Steve for a few seconds, analysing what she believed was going on in his head, before leaving to go to her room in the compound. Once inside, she reviewed the various things that Stark had said in the past few interactions. She narrowed it down that whoever had been calling Stark during all of their meetings must be the heir in question. Suddenly understanding his hostility to being asked questions about the caller, Natasha brought out her computer to try and find out who it was. She had no intention of revealing the name, only to know who it was herself. She began to try and hack into Stark's phone, but only succeeded in connecting to hearing his phone conversations. Unknown to Natasha, a certain AI smirked at how smug the spy was after thinking she could hack into the boss's phone. She began to listen to the conversation occurring. Mr. Stark, Tony. Sorry, Mr. Stark, thank you so much. I didn't know how much you would say, and I really don't want to be clustered by the press, and I can't believe that I'm your heir. And hey, what do you mean by your comment about how I might take over for Iron Man? Because I feel like I've got my own thing going. Not that I wouldn't want to, I just mean, breathe, kid. Let's talk about this in person. I didn't want you to be bothered by the press either. I'll send Happy to pick you up. He's not going to be happy about that. Not if you keep making those jokes. I'll talk to you when you get to the tower. Thanks, Mr. Stark. No problem, kid. I'll see you soon, Peter. A click echoed across the line. Natasha reared back in shock as the call disconnected and she was left staring at a blank screen with the message, You're welcome. Friday, scrolling across the screen. The spy leaned back in her chair. Not only did the kid almost call Tony Dad, but she also had a name now, Peter. Chapter 4. Natasha walked through the Avengers compound on her way to the conference room. Colonel Rhodes had called a meeting to go over new strategies. The spy heard footsteps approaching from behind her, and she turned to see Tony walking down the hallway after her. The genius took his glasses off and waved her down. Standing in the empty hallway, he glanced around and began to speak. So Friday has let me know that a certain spy has been trying to be sneaky about my kid. I wouldn't have gotten through if you didn't want me to. No, you wouldn't have. Natasha leveled her gaze at Tony. Why did I get through then? He smiled back. I'd rather keep you in a controlled environment than have you use all your resources and leak things to the press. I'm glad you trust me so much. His smile dropped. The word trust is a hard thing for me to use around any of you. I trust you enough not to hurt my kid. That should be enough for you. The spy nodded, and the two continued to walk in silence towards the conference room. Right as Tony was about to open the door, Natasha interrupted. Tony, thank you. I won't break your trust again. Tony stared at the spy, whose gaze was resting on the door, her emotions uncharacteristically open. She glanced back at him, and he nodded in acknowledgement. He opened the door to the sound of silence. Tony and Natasha walked into the room to the obvious aftermath of an argument. Rhodey was staring at Rogers with his arms crossed, the super soldier in the same position. Wanda was leaning back in her chair with a hand over her eyes in frustration. Sam was excitedly sitting in his chair, thinking about all of the theories he had read on Tumblr. Natasha sighed. Oh no, what happened now? Rogers spun around and fumed when he saw Tony. Why didn't you give us a notice that you have an heir? We're a team, we should know about these things in advance. The genius raised an eyebrow and looked at Rhodey. Have you had to deal with this for a while now? The colonel snorted. Thanks to your streak of showing up late to everything, yes. Rogers interrupted. We don't even know anything about this heir of yours. Where is he from? What's his name? Tony sniffed. I'll have you know he's from Queens. You don't have to worry about someone who's not from your precious New York. Rogers shot an irritated look at Tony. Excuse me, Natasha interrupted. I don't think this matters right now. Colonel Rhodes, you called us here for a strategy meeting? Rhodey's eyebrows rose in surprise. Wow, this is actually a reverse of what happened the second time the kid called in your presence. Rogers wants to know everything, and Natasha doesn't. I'll be suspicious of that later. For now, I want to address the fact that we need to be better at working together. Rhodey continued to speak about how the two sides of the Civil War tended to team up so that neither side really worked with each other. Right as he was talking about the new possibilities of air support in conjunction with the Avengers working on the ground, Friday interrupted. Boss, Spider-Man is currently fighting the Green Goblin. Tony stood up and activated the screen in the conference room. Friday, take his vitals in view. Connect him to this room. A shaky video popped up on the screen, and a ringing noise echoed throughout the room. An excited voice answered. Oh, hey, Mr. Stark. Hey, kid. What you doing right now? Nothing much. The Green Goblin picked up a car with an energy beam that he had created and threw the car at Spider-Man, who dodged and landed on the ground. That doesn't sound like nothing much. I'm not sure what you're talking about. Giggling, the Green Goblin shot the energy beam at Spider-Man, who jumped out of the way and looked back to see melting metal where he had just been standing. Whoa, Mr. Goblin, I didn't think you set your phaser to stun. You might want to get that checked out. Tony sighed. What have I told you about talking while fighting? Don't do it? Yes. You do it all the time. This is a do as I say, not as I do situation. Don't do anything you wouldn't, and don't do anything you would. Exactly. The Green Goblin continued to giggle uncontrollably while shooting beams around and causing massive destruction. Hey kid, why don't you web him up? He made a force field around himself. All right, kid, you're going to have to go to the mattress while I make my way out there. Tony turned away from the screen and asked for Friday to tell the Accords Committee he was going in, as Spider-Man was heard protesting from the screen. No, Mr. Stark, I have this under control. Also, The Godfather, really? The Godfather is one of the best movies of all time. Yeah, sure, whatever you say. Excuse me, I can at least enjoy quality films. What do you watch? High School Musical? You gotta get your head in the game, Mr. Stark. Also, didn't you quote Mean Girls the other day? No. Ha, I'm still coming. You won't distract me. Right at that moment, the Iron Man armor assembled around him, and Tony flew out of the conference room towards the battle. The feed disconnected from the screen, and the other Avengers were left sitting around the table in shock. Rhodey stood up. We should probably follow him. They all nodded and made their way to the Quinjet, flying towards Queens. They landed on top of a building in the vicinity of the battle and made their way through an area that was moderately destroyed because of the Green Goblin's energy beam. In the distance, they could see the police arresting the Green Goblin and Spider-Man standing next to Tony, whose helmet was off and was gesturing wildly at the neighborhood hero. They could just hear Tony from where they were walking from. No, you don't get to risk your life like that. I told you I was coming. I can't have you be hurt. I couldn't let him hurt that cat. Really? You're worried about the cat and not the property damage? Yes, Rogers interrupted their argument. It's always nice to meet someone who actually cares about living things. Spider-Man turned angrily towards Rogers. What did you say about Mr. Stark? I'll have you know. Ah! Parker's scream echoed into the distance as he flew off inside the Iron Man suit that Tony had deployed around him. Tony stood with his arms crossed in his Armani suit and glared at Steve. The Avengers stood there in silence until Sam chimed in. What was that? Tony continued to glare at Steve. Sam continued to speak. Because that was kind of weird. I was looking forward to the verbal battle, but now this is just suspect. Wanda sniffed and walked away, muttering about Stark. Steve crossed his arms and stared back at Tony. Natasha glanced between the two, while Sam continued to fill the silence. Rhodey finally chimed in on the comms. All right, people, head to the Quinjet. We need to have a debrief. A new Iron Man suit landed next to Tony, and he stepped into it, flying off to the compound. The other Avengers got back onto the Quinjet. Steve thought out loud while talking to Natasha and Sam. Tony said his heir is from Queens, right? I think I know a certain someone who's also from Queens. Sam gasped. You think that Spider-Man is his heir? One of my sources had that theory as well. Natasha stared at Sam. Your sources? Where are you getting information from? VB? Interpol? Sam paused for a moment and then said very quietly, Tumblr. Natasha sighed. You'd be surprised at the amount of things they get right. Sam whipped his head around to face her. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. No, please tell me. Nothing. Steve ignored the banter going on between the two and instead stared at the wall in front of him, the thought of Queens running through his head. Chapter 5. A figure wearing a blue baseball cap walked through the streets of Queens. The tall blond man kept his head down and flickered his eyes back and forth. The sun shined down on the streets and cars rushed past. A conversation caught the attention of the man. Stopping at a newspaper stand, he pretended to read the headlines while listening to the conversation. According to the Spider-Man watch list, he should be swinging through here sometime tonight. Why do you want to see him? Are you kidding me? He's so cool. I just want to be able to see a real-life superhero with my own eyes. You're such a nerd. Hey now, didn't you? The conversation faded away and the blond man glanced around. The older guy with glasses and a moustache running the newspaper stand, who looked a tad bit familiar to Steve, interrupted his thoughts. Hey, are you going to buy a paper or what? Steve made a non-committal noise and casually walked away. Once he was out of range of the newspaper stand, the older man turned to his next customer and remarked about the interaction. Superheroes these days, they all think we don't know who they are. Steve, ignorant of the remark, walked over to a coffee place that had outdoor seating. He ordered a drink and sat down, waiting to see if Spider-Man would swing past. The chair next to him pulled out with a loud grating noise, and a curly-haired teenager sat down across from him and began to sketch in her notebook. Steve stared at her. She continued to draw. Steve continued to stare. He cleared his throat. What are you doing? She looked up and smiled scarily at him. I like drawing people who are trying to be sneaky. I used to draw people in distress. You just presented the perfect opportunity. I don't know what you're talking about. She glanced upwards and made direct eye contact. Don't you? Steve frowned and looked away, flicking his eyes periodically over to where she sat. She continued to sketch until finally she laughed and turned the paper to face him. Look, it's you. A drawing of Steve in his full Avengers uniform and shield appeared on her paper, and she grinned at the shock that plastered across his face. Wait, how did you... Before he could finish his sentence, a shadow passed over the table. Both parties at the table looked up to see Spider-Man swinging by. As he went past, he waved. Hey, MJ. Hey, Spider-Man. Steve stood up to follow the vigilante, but was distracted by MJ clearing her throat. Where are you going in such a rush, Steve? The super soldier paused. Before he could come up with a response, Spider-Man disappeared around the corner of the street and was lost from view. A buzzing was heard, and MJ took out her phone and glanced at a text. He stood up to leave. You can do what you want. I don't care anymore. Steve looked at her phone, a brand new Stark phone, and commented on it. I didn't think those were on the market yet. He looked down at the phone and responded to Steve, completely deadpan. Oh, I have a friend. His dad gave me a mission to stop someone from doing something they'd regret. This was my payment. She smiled at Steve and turned to leave. Have a nice day, Steve Rogers. Natasha walked through the corridors of the Avengers compound. As she approached the wing where most of the housing rooms were located, she stopped at the only ajar door with the nameplate Steve Rogers attached to it. Knocking on the open door to get his attention, she walked through to the sight of Steve on the computer, watching videos of Spider-Man on the screen. Natasha crossed her arms, and Steve spun around on the chair. Hey, Natasha, how are you today? The spy raised an eyebrow and gestured to his computer. Steve turned to look at it and then turned back towards the spy with an embarrassed smile on his face. He sighed and began to speak. What are you doing, Steve? I'm just doing some research. It seems to me like you're doing something that one of our teammates doesn't want you to be doing. Steve looked at Natasha with a confused expression on his face. Are you on his side now? The spy sighed again. I hate this, Steve. I hate that we've been torn into two sides. We used to be a family. Why must you and Tony keep doing this? I can't trust Tony if he keeps secrets from us. He can't trust you if you can't trust him to protect someone he cares about. The word trust is thrown around so much. Why do you have to know everything he does? You certainly didn't tell him about the things he should have known. I had to protect Bucky. Natasha stared down at the super soldier, who was now standing up and gesturing around. Her expression was completely blank, and Steve calmed down in confusion after the silence reigned for what felt like a minute. The spy began to speak. Steve, you are such a big hypocrite. You kept secrets about the death of your teammate's parents, and you're criticizing him for protecting his son. At least we know he has one. You never told him anything. You knew about it too. You told me that you would tell him. Thought that you would keep your word. You keep talking of trust, but you chose my side instead of Stark's. Oh, Steve, I was on Stark's side. I agreed with the accords. I only switched to yours because I was scared that the Avengers would separate. I regret that decision. Separated anyways, and now I have to try and make it up to someone who once regarded me as family. So you just sit here and think about that. Steve stared at Natasha in shock and lowered his head. The spy turned around and began to walk out the door. He paused at the entryway and looked back at the super soldier. You both want to protect the people you love and care about. Trust will come once you allow him to do that without prying. The spy left the room and closed the door on her way out. Steve sat in his chair and stared at the floor. Chapter 6. Steve, Sam, Wanda, and Natasha all sat in a car that was slowly making its way through New York City traffic. Wanda sighed and turned to Steve. Why are we doing this again? Steve returned the sigh. We're doing this because we need to apologize to Tony for how we've acted. It's the only way to hopefully start functioning as a team again. Wanda sighed. Steve turned to Sam. Do you have any objections to add? Sam shrugged. Nah, man, I already talked to Tony. I'm not quite sure what took you so long to do the same, but we worked it out. Steve stared at him. Why are you here then? Sam smiled. There will no doubt be drama with this interaction, and I am 100% here for that. Natasha chuckled, and the other three turned to look at her. Steve narrowed his eyes. Anything you'd like to add? The spy shook her head and declined to speak further on the topic. Instead, she proceeded to swear in Russian at the other motorists. Steve sighed once again, Russian starting to become his signature state. Leaning his head back, he closed his eyes and muttered, You guys are all no help. The others ignored him. Eventually their car pulled up to the parking ramp entrance that SI and those affiliated with Stark were able to use. Natasha rolled down the window and began to speak to the interface that controlled the parking ramp. It was Friday, of course. The others couldn't hear the conversation, but they all looked up in confusion as the door to the ramp never opened, and Natasha rolled up the window in anger and screeched backwards in the car. Steve raised an eyebrow. What's going on? Natasha continued to mumble in Russian. Wanda made a humming noise. It appears as if we are not authorized to access Stark's building. How accurate to his character. Sam interjected. You do know that it's probably Friday being salty, and Stark has no idea, right? Wanda proceeded to mumble under her breath. Silence reigned in the car until Natasha finally whipped the vehicle into a parallel parking spot. They all climbed out and the spy aggressively locked the car, which responded with a happy beeping noise. They made their way to the Stark Tower, pushing through the heavy foot traffic on all of the sidewalks. As they walked, the usual excited fans were missing, and the looks were replaced with ones of trepidation. Well, mostly. A group of teenagers stopped and asked Sam for an autograph and a few selfies, saying that they had followed his social media accounts and loved his commentary on the whole situation. He stopped to talk with them, gesturing for the others to go ahead without him. The three continued to walk towards the tower. It loomed above them. As they approached the tower, the automatic doors opened for them. Natasha and Wanda walked through them, but as Steve entered, the doors closed around him and he jolted forward with a shriek. Natasha snorted as Steve casually brushed himself off, trying to look as if what had just happened hadn't. They kept walking towards the elevator that would take them up to the private levels, but a security guard jumped in front of him and crossed his arms. I'm sorry to interrupt, but it appears as if you haven't signed in at the front desk. Please do so before you continue on your current course. Steve stepped forward to confront the guard about the fact that they had never had to do that before, but Natasha grabbed his arm and dragged him towards the desk. As they walked that way, Wanda trailing behind them, Natasha growled quietly into Steve's ear. You are here to apologize, not to start a fight. Get your act together, Rogers. He sighed and put on a pleasant smile as they approached the main desk. The receptionist looked up from his computer, and his traditional smile that was reserved for guests to the building faded when he saw Steve Rogers in front of him. "Oh, it's you. I'm afraid you're not on the guest list, so you will be unable to access the private levels." Natasha chimed in. "Would it be possible to ask Friday whether Mr. Stark is available at the current moment?" "It's Dr. Stark." "What?" "It's Dr. Stark. You said Mr. Stark, and I felt like correcting you." Steve frowned and confronted the receptionist. "Why are you being so hostile to us? Did Stark put you up to this?" The receptionist raised an eyebrow. "Dr. Stark put me up to nothing. As to your question of why I am being hostile, well, that has many answers. The first being what you did to Mr. Stark. The second being that my boyfriend works for the United Nations and has regaled me with tales of your demeaning actions at his workplace." Natasha stopped Steve before he could respond and looked at the receptionist with a dazzling smile. "We apologize for our actions and will try to manage them in the future. Could you ask Friday whether Dr. Stark is available at this time?" The receptionist gave her a deadpan look. "What is the matter you wish to discuss with Dr. Stark?" Natasha nudged Steve, who responded, "We wish to apologize to Dr. Stark." The receptionist smirked and looked at his computer, where a message from Friday had just appeared. "It appears that Dr. Stark may have a small slot in his schedule at the moment. If you would proceed to the elevator on your right, you will be brought to the conference room on the private level." They nodded and made their way over to the elevator. The doors closed and the elevator began to, very slowly, inch its way upwards. Steve sighed. "Conference room. I bet the Stark will be in his lab and completely ignore us the entire time." Wanda snorted in agreement. "We might as well go directly to his lab." Steve nodded. "It's a plan, then. Wanda, can you bring the elevator to the level where his lab is, and then open the doors?" Wanda grinned at Steve, and her red magic leaked into the space. Shooting upwards, the elevator came to a stop at the level where Stark's lab was located, and the doors jolted open, revealing the white corridor that led to the lab's entrance. Steve and Wanda got out of the elevator. Turning around, they saw that Natasha was still standing in the elevator with her arms crossed. Steve frowned. "Aren't you coming with?" The spy narrowed her eyes. "We're here to apologize, Steve. I am not going along with this plan." Wanda shrugged. "Suit yourself." The doors closed and the magic dissipated from the space. Natasha sighed and directed her gaze at the camera that rested in the corner of the space that the other two hadn't noticed. "Friday, is Tony even in his lab?" There was a pause. "Boss is not in his lab, but someone else is." Natasha's eyebrows rose. "Where is Tony, then?" "In the kitchen." "The kitchen?" "He's making pasta." Natasha gave a shocked look at the camera, so very confused at the things that she was being told. Not only was Tony in the kitchen making pasta, someone else was in the lab. "Tony's cooking. Never mind. Can you warn him about what's about to happen in the lab?" "Boss put me on mute. Unfortunately, it extends to both the kitchen and the lab, so I can warn neither party." "All right. Can you take me to the kitchen so that I can warn Tony, then?" "Right away, Miss Romanov." The elevator shot upwards at a very fast pace. Opening into a view of the living room, Natasha stepped out and made her way to the kitchen, where loud Italian music was playing. Tony was standing at the stove with a spatula in hand, dumping a collection of ingredients into a mix that he was creating for the sauce. Natasha cleared her throat and he whirled around, spatula ready to defend himself, wearing an apron that had a picture of the periodic table symbol for iron and the word man underneath it. Natasha raised an eyebrow as Tony relaxed out of his defensive position and casually rested his hand on the island. "Natasha, what are you doing here?" "Well, I came with the other Avengers to try and get them to apologize to you. Unfortunately, they were under the assumption that you would be in the lab, and that therefore they are currently forcing their way into it." Tony's eyes widened as he whipped the apron off. Handing the spatula to Natasha, he looked her in the eyes. "Watch the pasta." With the statement, he ran off to the elevator, the Iron Man gauntlet forming from his watch. Natasha sighed and looked down at the spatula. The elevator closed with the view of the Russian spy slowly turning the pasta so it didn't boil over, and giving the finger to the retreating figure on his way to help his son. Stephen Wonder crept down the hallway towards the reinforced doors that covered the entrance to the lab. They could hear music blaring through the doors, and Wanda frowned. "Is Stark listening to Hamilton and not hard rock?" Steve shrugged and walked up to the door. When he grabbed the handle and tried to push the door open, it stayed locked. Wanda sighed and her magic crept towards the door, forcing it open slowly. The music came shooting out full blast into the corridor, and they heard a piece of metal drop onto the ground. A voice made an exclamation, and more banging was heard coming from the lab. Steve and Wanda walked into the sight of Stark's lab spread out in front of them. Walking forwards, they could see a pair of legs jutting out from under one of the cars. Steve smirked, realizing that Tony must have dropped something and had to fit it out. Serves him right for having cars in the lab. The table next to the car was littered with dismantled tech, and a backpack was sitting nearby. Steve frowned. Why would Stark have a backpack in the lab? The music stopped playing as they walked forward, and the figure under the car tensed, somehow realizing they were there. Steve crossed his arms and waited for Tony to climb out from underneath the car. Wanda was not so patient. She wrapped her red magic around the leg of the person under the car and yanked them out. A startled scream split the air, and instead of Stark, out came a gangly teenager with a surprised and scared expression. In her surprise, Wanda dropped the magic around his leg and put her hand over her mouth. The teenager flailed his arm toward the desk, where Steve noticed one of Spider-Man's web shooters was sitting. The teen's hand wrapped around a piece of tech, and it formed around his hand, shooting a beam of energy towards the two Avengers. Steve and Wanda dropped to the ground to avoid the beam coming from the Iron Man gauntlet that the kid had grabbed. The kid backed up and hit the table behind him. He continued to point the gauntlet at the two and breathed heavily as his other hand searched for something behind him. Steve stood up with his hands raised. "Okay, kid, I don't know how you're able to use that piece of tech. I don't think you understand its capabilities. If you could set it down, we can talk this out." Wanda snorted. "I think it's quite obvious how he's able to use that. He must be Stark's kid." The teenager continued to point the gauntlet at them, and Wanda formed her magic in her hands, ready to take the gauntlet off by force. Before she could do so, the kid found what he had been searching for, and suddenly both Avengers were stuck to the wall, Wanda's hands immobile and Steve's legs wrapped together. They looked down and saw the substance they were covered in seems to be some kind of webbing. The kid put down his hand, the gauntlet still attached, and crossed his arms while peering at the two startled Avengers. The kid opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Tony burst through the door to the lab, frantically looking around, and an Iron Man gauntlet around his hand as well. He skidded over to his kid and stopped when he saw Steve and Wanda stuck to the wall. He looked over at Peter and smiled when he saw the gauntlet around the kid's arm. Peter spoke up. "Oh hey, we match." Tony chuckled. "Sure do, kid." Tony's smile dropped as he turned to look at the Avengers stuck to the wall. "You come to my tower, you break into my lab, and you attack my kid. Natasha told me that you came here to apologize, and I don't see how this classifies as such." Peter interjected. "Actually, I think they thought I was you. So, technically they didn't purposefully attack me." "They would have purposefully attacked you, though. Which, come on, guys, really? Come on, people. Sorry, MJ keeps giving me lectures on accidental gendering groups of people. It's starting to stick. Fun, because spiders. Anyway, hi, I'm Peter." Peter waved and Tony rolled his eyes while Steve and Wanda stared at him in shock. Wanda's eyes twitched. "It's another Stark." Tony smiled. "Oh yes, he is." Peter opened his mouth to continue speaking, but Tony cut him off. How about you head up to the kitchen? The pasta's almost ready, and I know how much you want to meet Natasha. Peter gasped. Black Widow's upstairs. Dad, oh my gosh. I'm gonna go there now. Bye, Steve. Bye, Wanda. Peter ran out the door, and the other two stared at Tony in shock. Steve cleared his throat. Well, he certainly is a lot like you. Tony continued to stare at the two who were still webbed to the wall. Steve continued to speak. So, Tony, we're here to talk to you and apologize for our actions. Tony raised an eyebrow. I thought we already talked about this. Yes, but nothing's improved since we talked. Steve, it's not going to solve itself right away. So far, you haven't shown me any reason for why I can trust you. I've told you. Yes, you've told me. That's the thing. Your actions don't align with your words. I understand that you're used to everything getting solved right away, but that's not what's going to happen here. We can work together, fine, but it's not going to become all cuddles and rainbows. You almost killed me, Steve. Don't understand how you think I can just forget that. I understand that you want to apologize, and that makes me feel a little better. However, you have to correspond your actions with your words, and that hasn't seemed to happen yet. All right, this talk is done. I'm going to go eat dinner with my kid, and maybe Natasha or Sam if he shows up. They've apologized with actions. What? Could you get us out of these webs? They'll wear off in about an hour or so. Friday will escort you off the premises when they do. Tony uncrossed his arms and walked out of the door, leaving Steve and Wanda trapped together. Wanda sighed and rested her head against the wall. Now we have to deal with two Starks. Natasha looked up from the pasta when she heard an excited gasp in the vicinity. Looking up, she saw a teenager with tousled brown hair and a t-shirt that said, I have potential, with a picture of a ball on the top of a slope. He bounced up and down on his toes. Hi, oh my gosh, Black Widow, I'm so excited to meet you. My name's Peter. You're so cool. I mean, aside from the whole Accords incident, but aside from that, wow. You can call me Natasha. You must be Stark's kid. Peter smiled back at her. You just told me to call you Natasha. This is incredible. I'm so excited right now. You're so badass. Cool. I mean, cool. Yeah, Tony liked to call me his kid. Natasha raised an eyebrow, but before she could respond, Sam turned the corner and stopped at the view he saw. Black Widow aggressively turning a pot of pasta with an excited teenager bouncing nearby. The teenager turned his gaze to Sam, and he started to freak out again. Hi, Falcon, this is so cool. I'm Peter. I just have to say, I follow you on Tumblr. Yes, everyone knows your account. You weren't that sneaky. And I love your commentary so much. It's hilarious. Sam smiled. You must be Stark's kid. Peter sighed. I didn't think it was that obvious. I mean, come on, he's... Natasha and Sam both tuned out Peter's rant and shared a look with each other, aghast at Peter's denial that seemed similar to Tony. And he's all like pew-pew with his tech and stuff, and I just kind of swing around, and I'm all like... Tony interrupted the rant while entering the kitchen. Did you just refer to the Iron Man suit as making a pew-pew noise? Peter gulped. Absolutely not. I don't know what you're talking about. Natasha chuckled at Peter's response, but quickly turned and threw the spatula at Tony, who fumbled to catch it. The spy glared at him. Watch your own pasta. I didn't want it to boil over while I was gone. Sam chimed in. Speaking of gone, where's Steve and Wanda? Peter's mouth spasmed. I think they're hanging out. Tony smiled. They seem to be in a sticky situation. Natasha groaned as Sam laughed. Tony winked at Peter and took the pasta off the stove, mixing it with the sauce that he had put together. Peter looked at Natasha and Sam. Do you two want to stay for dinner? Natasha looked at Sam and nodded. Sure, why not? Two Starks should make for some good entertainment. Chapter 7. A continuation. The camera focused on a school in the middle of Queens. Scanning the crowd, it landed on the mess of exiting students. A teenager with messy brown hair and a wide smile on his face began to rush down the stairs. He entered a well-known car. The car was registered with Stark Industries and was a favourite of the head of security. The cameras clicked. The woman holding the camera grinned. She had what she needed. To be continued. Just a Glimpse Beyond the Illusion by TinyButFierce. From The Word I'm Looking For. 2. Chapter 1. Whispers permeated the streets. Newspapers fluttered in the wind, and headlines announcing that Tony Stark had chosen an heir decorated the front pages for days. Most of the news sources had chosen to align with what Pepper Potts and the entire PR department of Stark Industries had requested. Others didn't. Favors were called in, bribes changed hands, security was put on high alert. Pepper Potts watched it all happen from her window-lined office. Standing and looking out of the window over the city, she crossed her arms and sighed. It had taken days of negotiation with the board and Tony to lay out the way that the press conference was going to go. The only reason that it had been necessary for them to reveal that information that, yes, Tony Stark did, in fact, have an heir, was because of how hard a hit Iron Man had taken the day before. Videos had littered the news of Iron Man limping off the battlefield, and the board consequently created a riot. Frantic about the fact that every time Iron Man took a hit, the stocks went down, they demanded that Tony release to the public that he did in fact have an heir. The board had been notified of the fact a few months before. Pepper watched the cars pass by below her and thought about how Tony had returned from the battle that night. Suppressing his pain, he had smiled at her and croaked out a "Hey, Pep," at his fiancée, before groaning and clutching his side. He had rushed forward and, with the help of Friday, convinced him to get medical assistance. 2 broken ribs. The nurse on call bandaged him up, with no lack of trouble from Tony. Pepper had paced outside, watching the emails and calls on her phone add up. The nurse walked out of the room and nodded at Pepper, who rushed in to the sight of Tony attempting to get up from the bed. The CEO sighed and sat down next to him, stroking her hand through his hair as he grimaced and tried to bat her hands away, a small smile playing on his face. Her phone buzzed again. Looking down at it, she sighed, and Tony frowned. "What's going on, Pep?" Placed the phone on the side table and looked her fiancé in the eyes. "It's the board. They want you to release information about Peter's position so that the stocks stop getting hurt, as whenever you go to fight." Tony's eyes turned hard. "Absolutely not." Tony, Pepper, I had to deal with the press my entire life, and I am not subjecting Peter to that kind of torment. I know exactly what they'll say about him. Do you think they'll believe he's not mine biologically? Do you think that the kids at his school will treat him the same? Do you think he'll ever be able to go to a movie without being accosted by the paparazzi? Tony, I can't do that to him, Pep. I know. I I can't do that to him. Tony had focused on a spot on the wall across from him and stared it down. Pepper took off her heels and climbed in next to him. Touching his face and turning it towards her, she looked him in the eyes and made a promise. "We'll figure out something." That had been 2 weeks ago. From that time, the press had continued to send their lurking fingers through all sorts of aisles. Tony's heart problems had only been increased with the fact that the Avengers had found a way to actually meet Peter while he was in the safety of the tower. Pepper had sat down with the board with CEOs of news corporations and negotiated because she made a promise to keep Peter safe from all of Tony's fears. He wished she had been there when the Avengers had breached the tower. Unfortunately, negotiating deals with the press for their silence on the matter had required her to fly across the country. He wasn't there to defend her boys. A knock sounded on her door and she turned around to see her assistant walk in. They covered the normal stuff. Signatures that were needed, schedules to change, expenses for the new model of the Stark phone. Oh, and that WHIH claimed to have discovered the identity of the Stark heir. Pepper paused and looked up in shock at the last piece of information, demanding to see proof. As her assistant walked out of the room, Friday projected the announcement. Christine Everhart. Of course. Apparently, the investigative reporter had discovered lots of information and had ignored all of Pepper's careful negotiations. It had been reported on WHIH's website that there would be an hour-long special that very day about the matter of the Stark heir. Pepper's eye twitched, and she exhaled angrily. Running her hands through her hair, she stared down at the table. Friday interrupted. Miss Potts? My information lists Miss Everhart as someone to be watched. You want me to inform Boss? Pepper looked up and smiled at the nearest camera. No need to tell Tony about this right now. Christine and I have an interesting relationship. Let's just say that I once alluded to her being trash. She's tended to not cooperate since then. Fragile ego. I see. All right. Friday, can you connect me to the head of WHIH? Pepper spent the next hour on the phone. It ended in Pepper placing the phone gently onto the table and steepling her fingers while spinning around in her chair. That had been a thoroughly uncooperative call. They refused to stop the broadcast and refused to give her any information on what they would be releasing. Pepper sighed. All right, Friday. Contact legal about what's about to go down, freedom of the press and all that. We'll see if we can nail them with privacy violations or an ethics court. Tell PR to get ready with a statement and possibly a press conference. Let May know about the broadcast. Tony and Peter in the penthouse. Yes, Miss Potts. Tell them I'm coming up. Chapter 2. The sun shone through the bulletproof windows that lined the walls of the penthouse. In the living room, papers decorated with chemistry equations littered a modern coffee table. Peter scribbled on one of the sheets with a pen, while Tony leaned back on the couch and glanced over calculations that the teen had already written down. A highlighter rested between his fingers, and he spun it around, stopping to emphasize an equation every once in a while. Friday interrupted the piece. Sorry to bother you, boss. Miss Potts is on her way up. She has something to discuss with both of you. Tony looked up at the camera in concern. What is it? I'm going to let her tell you. Peter set his pen down and looked at Tony. The billionaire made eye contact and shrugged, setting down the highlighter and turning towards the entrance to the room as the sound of clicking heels made itself known. Pepper walked into the room and smiled as she saw Tony and Peter sitting with mounds of science around them. She sat down on the chair adjacent to Tony and Peter and noticed the concerned looks that the two were sending her way. Tony swallowed. So, Pep, what's up? Is this about the wedding? I swear that I contacted the florist, and I did get the ones you wanted. Pepper sighed. I wish it was about the wedding. No, it's about the press conference that we had a few weeks ago, the one announcing that you had an heir. Apparently, a certain Christine Everhart has a special about the identity of the heir that will be 100% aired tonight. Peter's eyes grew wide and his breath hitched. He began to speak in a small voice. Does that mean they know who I am now? Tony glanced at Peter, his eyes full of concern. We don't know that for sure. Peter looked down and fidgeted with his shirt. Tony flicked his gaze towards Pepper and jerked his head towards the kitchen. The CEO got up and walked that way, leaving Tony with Peter momentarily. Tony looked in concern at the teenager, who averted his eyes away. Hey, kiddo, look at me. Peter flickered his eyes back up to Tony, who gave the kid a small smile. We'll figure it out, don't worry. Chances are they have the wrong person. If they do guess that it's you, then we'll take the necessary steps, okay? Teen nodded, and Tony sighed. I'm going to go talk to Pepper real quick. Will you be okay over here? The teen nodded again, and Tony regretfully stood up from the couch and headed over to where Pepper was standing in the kitchen. He immediately walked over to the cupboards and pulled out 3 mugs, filling them up with water and putting them in the microwave. As he watched the timer tick down, he turned to look at Pepper, who was leaning against the counter, gazing at him with a sad look in her eyes. The timer continued to tick down, and he took a deep breath. "What are we going to do, Pep?" The CEO glared at the countertop. "I've tried every single thing I could think of to stop this from happening. I even channeled you and threatened to buy WHIH News. The lawyers could have had fun with that one." Tony gaped at his fiancée. "I'm so proud of you. It's usually me who threatens to buy everything. Am I being a bad influence on you?" Pepper grimaced. "It was my last resort." The microwave beeped, and Tony opened the door to pull out 3 cups full of hot water. Digging 3 hot chocolate packets out of a drawer, he poured the powder into the water and stirred it with a spoon. The aroma wafted through the whole kitchen, and Pepper raised an eyebrow at the use of the hot chocolate powder. "Really? Powder version?" "I'm going for comfort, not style." Pepper nodded and accepted the cup that Tony handed to her. The billionaire picked up the other 2 cups and started walking back to the living room, Pepper trailing behind him. Handing the cup to Peter, the 3 sat down around the table. Peter sipped some of the hot chocolate and looked around at the 2 adults. "So, what's the plan?" Tony glanced over at Pepper and nodded. The CEO set down her hot chocolate on the table and sighed. "Well, at this point we can't stop the broadcast. I've tried everything that I could legally do." Tony raised his hand and waved it around. Pepper raised an eyebrow. "Yes, Tony?" "I could call Natasha and have her stop the broadcast. I'm sure she'll be happy to help her spider buddy." Peter giggled while Pepper stared at Tony. "Tempting, but no. I said legally for a reason, Tony." Turning to look back at Peter, Pepper continued. "If they got the identity wrong, then we will just make a statement saying so. If they did somehow find out that it's you, then we have 3 options. Option 1 is to deny it. I would rather not do that, though, given that you are in fact the heir. Option 2 is radio silence. Once again, I would rather not do that. PR would give us hell for ignoring this. Option 3 is to hold a press conference." Peter flinched. Tony and Pepper both looked at the teen in concern before looking at each other. They communicated in glances. Pepper's phone buzzed. The CEO looked down at all of her messages and groaned. "All right, I have to head down to PR now. I'll try and hold them off as long as I can, but we will have to do something. I had Friday contact May to tell her what's about to happen. It's probably good that we arranged for you to stay here over the summer. We can keep better control over the fallout from the tower. The broadcast should start in an hour. I'll be back up here by then." Placing a hand on Tony's shoulder and sending one last concerned glance towards Peter, Pepper walked out of the penthouse to go put out the fires in PR and start some fires in the legal department. Not literally, of course. That's the R&D's job. Tony and Peter were left alone. Peter's hot chocolate was drained and the empty cup sat on the table. Making a noise of concern, Tony moved to sit next to Peter and enveloped the teen in a hug. The teen reciprocated and clung on to his mentor. The silence became too much for the genius, too used to Peter filling up any pause in a conversation. "Hey, Pete, did I ever tell you about the first press conference I was ever in?" A muffled "no" came from where Peter had rested his head against Tony's chest. "I was about 4. This was right after I made my first circuit board. Howard decided to tout it around, even though he was critical of the work when we got home. Anyways, he made me have a press conference. Now remember, I was 4. Let's just say that I didn't take kindly to some of the questions, and I ended up biting one of the reporters. I made him bleed." "Ha!" Peter looked up at Tony in confusion. "Wait, if this was a press conference, how did you get close enough to bite him?" "The logistics aren't important." Peter giggled. Tony looked down at the teen fondly. "To sum up this story, I have set a very low bar for performance during a press conference premiere. If that's what we end up having to do, I'm sure you can beat that." Peter sniffed and ended the hug, sitting up to look at Tony with wide brown eyes. You really think so? Think so? I know so. Peter smiled and looked down. Tony placed a hand on Peter's shoulder. All right, you clean up these papers. I'm going to go order a pizza and whip up some popcorn. We need to celebrate your first day as a paparazzi-prone Stark. Peter smiled and picked up the papers, heading towards his room. Once he was out of sight, the smile dropped from Tony's face. He had gotten used to his private life being invaded. Now Peter would have to as well. Chapter 3. The WHIH logo danced across the screen. Images of world events scrolled within it as the colours streamed together and subtracted into the corner. The blonde reporter smiled at the camera with a vulture-like glint in her eye. Good evening. My name is Christine Everhart. Today's special report is an investigation into the remarks made a few weeks ago by billionaire and Iron Man Tony Stark. She turned to face a different camera as a photo of Tony wearing a three-piece suit and his classic sunglasses appeared on the screen next to her. For the next 15 minutes of the broadcast, she elaborated on Tony's history, as if no one watching knew anything about him. Finally, the clip from SI's recent press conference was shown. Tony leaned against the podium and looked into the camera. In the past year or so, I have been training a replacement for myself. While he is not mine biologically, he has levels of intellect that rival my own and compassion that I never had. There is no one better that I would name my heir. He has my entire confidence, and I'm sure he will earn yours. The clip faded into the background, and Christine was on screen again. Smiling at the camera, she continued. Due to the investigative nature of WHIH News, we have successfully identified the new Stark heir. Coming soon, after this commercial break. The commercials began to run, and a certain group of people stared daggers at the screen hanging in their penthouse living room. Pepper Potts, Peter Parker, and Tony Stark all sat in silence while a commercial advertising Mini Coopers played in the background. Tony cleared his throat. Hey, will anyone else notice how they edited out my statement about please don't look for him and he's still in school? Pepper glared at the TV. We noticed. Tony looked around at the people in the room. This is all a bunch of crap. Look at this terrible suspense. How can people watch this? Friday, how many people are watching this? Friday paused for a second. 20 million viewers, boss. Peter made a choking noise. Tony patted him on the back. Aw, that's less than a quarter of the amount who watch the Super Bowl every year. Before Pepper could reprimand Tony about traumatizing Peter any more, the elevator to the penthouse dinged. Looking back towards the entrance, the three were greeted to the sight of Rhodey walking in. Tony's gaze landed on the braces wrapped around the colonel's legs, and his eyes hardened with guilt. Rhodey, noticing the look, raised his eyebrow at Tony. They had already had the guilt complex conversation before, and he did not want to have to repeat it. Peter looked up and waved at the colonel. Rhodey smiled in response. I heard what was happening, and I came here as fast as I could. There's a crowd building up outside the tower. Tony groaned. Great. Rhodey patted Tony on the shoulder and sat down on the chair next to the couch where the other three were spread out. Glancing at the TV, now advertising some medicine with too many side effects, Rhodey settled in on the chair and turned to look at Peter. Have they said who they think you are yet, or are they just talking about Tony incessantly? Peter smiled at the colonel. Talking about Tony incessantly. Rhodey nodded and started to grin. Have they talked about the MIT noodle incident? Tony's eyes widened comically, and he started to panic. Absolutely not. Rhodey, no. Pepper sighed and smiled when Peter sat up straighter and looked Rhodey with a gleam in his eye. Please tell. The colonel smiled at Peter and winked at Tony, who immediately covered his face. Well, so Tony here decided that WHIH music started to chime and the group quietened. Rhodey threw in a quick, tell you later, as they all focused on the TV once again. Christine Everhart showed up on the screen with her usual grin.
Welcome back. Last we left off, we covered the background of Tony Stark. Now is when we focus on his heir. Christine turned to face the other camera, and a picture of Midtown appeared next to her. Tony swore under his breath. Pepper shot a warning glance at her fiancé. Future spottings of Tony Stark and his driver during various occasions at the Midtown School of Science and Technology, we were able to discern the identity of his heir. A picture of none other than Peter Parker appeared on the screen. It was blurry and obviously taken from a distance. It showed the teen getting into one of the cars that Happy liked to drive. All four people in the penthouse froze. In this photo, you can clearly see that the teenager known as Peter Parker getting into a car belonging to Stark Industries and its fleet of drivers. When questioned, his classmates described him as smart, solitary, and, oh, he also has an internship at Stark Industries. The SI logo appeared under the photo of Peter. We sent an undercover agent to Stark Industries on the trail of the internship. When we got in contact with the person in charge of the program, we were told in no uncertain terms that the internship was for college students only. So how did an orphan teen from Queens just happen to get an internship in a program that doesn't accept high schoolers? The answer is quite obvious. It's a cover-up. The images changed to the old Forbes magazine cover that was taken with Obadiah Stane and Tony when he was about to take over the company. Next to the cover was a better photo of Peter, obviously taken from the school newspaper's coverage of the science team. Seeing the photo with Obadiah, Tony tensed up. Pepper sent a glance towards Tony and then looked over at Peter. The teen was staring at the TV, but it didn't look like he was focusing. He was frozen, lots of thoughts running through his head. Pepper nudged Tony and tilted her head towards Peter. Seeing the distress on his mentee's face, Tony stood up. All right, I'm done watching this. They're bringing out the photos of me in my 20s, and nothing good can come of that. Peter, we're going down to the lab. Peter jerked his eyes away from the screen. I thought we had to watch this. Tony laughed. Nope, we do not need to watch this. Come on, you don't have to subject yourself to this. Lab, 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 let's go. Peter stood up from the couch and followed Tony out of the room. Pepper and Rhodey were left. Rhodey sighed and looked over at Pepper. Kid doesn't deserve this. The CEO shook her head and took her phone out. Notifications popped up and Pepper growled under her breath. Rhodey looked over at her in concern. What's up? The legal team just got back to me. Apparently, New York has no laws that prohibit releasing information about a minor. There's just a lot of ethical problems rather than anything we can actually do legally. The colonel frowned. What can we do? Pepper looked up with a shark-like grin. We can make sure that WHIH News never gets to come to an SI or Avengers event ever again. Works for me. The two went quiet as they continued to watch the program all the way to the end. Pepper stood up when it finished and the TV turned off. I'm sorry to leave you, but I have to go meet with PR. Rhodey waved it off and slowly stood up from where he was sitting. No worries, I'll go check on the two geniuses, make sure they haven't blown up anything yet. The two parted and Rhodey made his way to the lab. Stepping inside, he was greeted to the sight of Tony and Peter bent over one of the Iron Man suits. Peter was working with the wiring inside it, while Tony looked on, his eyes revealing a dash of pride at the sight. Rhodey cleared his throat and the two looked up at him simultaneously and smiled. Tony put his hand on Peter's shoulder and told him to keep working. The billionaire walked over towards his best friend and ushered them into the hallway. The smile dropped off his face. How'd the rest of it go? Let's just say that Everhart basically revealed everything about him, except the Spider-Man thing. Oh, everyone also thinks he's your biological son. I figured. What did Pepper say? She went down to the PR department. You should probably join her. Tony glanced around the door and looked in at Peter, whose tongue was clenched between his teeth in concentration. Rhodey looked in as well and smirked. I can see why they would think you're related. I can look after the kid. You go down to PR. Tony sighed and clasped Rhodey's shoulder. Thanks. No problem. Tony walked down the hallway towards the elevator, and Rhodey went over to Peter. The team looked up with concern in his eyes, but Rhodey quickly dispelled it with a sentence that he uttered. All right, let me tell you about the noodle incident. Chapter 4. Secret Stark, son. Top 10 reactions to the SI reveal. BuzzFeed presents The Adorable Stark Heir. What will Stark Industries do next? Peter Parker and the X? Playboy? Silence from the Starks. When will they speak out? Heir apparent. Who is Peter Parker? Not biological. I think not. Tony scrubbed the hand down his face as he took a quick pause in reading all of the headlines scattering the news. Friday paused the scrolling articles on the screen as a knock sounded on the other side of the office door. But Tony's quiet, "Come in," the door opened to reveal Pepper, a concerned look on her face. You're in your office. Wasn't this the sign of the apocalypse? Tony chuckled. Pepper's in the lab, and I didn't want him to see all of this. Pepper went silent for a minute and watched Tony with a gentle gaze. The billionaire looked up and noticed the look in her eyes. What? The CEO closed the door and sat in a chair across from Tony. Setting her Stark pad down on the desk, she pulled up a list that she had received from the PR department. In 2 days. We'll have to announce something. Tony, I'm sorry, but Peter will have to do something. I don't want him to have to do anything. Tony, no. Pepper looked away from her fiancé and projected one of the possible options up from the screen. Tony glanced over at it and, after reading the option, leaned forward. A closed interview. That seems really obvious, and I can't believe that I didn't think about it before. The CEO grinned. A lot better than a press conference, and better than a statement. Do you think that you can talk to Peter about it? If he says yes, then we can release a statement about more information coming out later this week, and we can make sure that one of WHIH's rivals gets the job. We can also control what gets out. Exactly. Go pitch it to the kid. Tony swiped his screen down and stood up from the desk. Grabbing his coffee, he paused to give Pepper a quick kiss before exiting his offices, and walking down to his lab. Yay. The door swished open, and he was greeted to the sight of Peter stuck to the ceiling with webs, and Butterfingers gesturing wildly underneath, a web shooter in his claw. Dummy was approaching the scene at high speeds with one of his fire extinguishers. Peter was yelling instructions at you to grab the solution and to get rid of the webs, and oh no, Dummy, please don't. After Peter, still stuck, had somehow gotten doused with the fire extinguisher, even though he was on the ceiling, Tony cleared his throat. Everyone in the lab froze. Tony raised an eyebrow and walked forward slowly. As he advanced, Butterfingers scrambled into a far corner of the lab. Dummy lowered his fire extinguisher and rolled back a few feet. You approached with the solution for the webs, and Peter waved awkwardly from the ceiling. Hey, Mr. Stark. Tony sighed. Without responding to the greeting, he grabbed the dunce cap off of his work table and placed it on Dummy. He put the fire extinguisher down and bumped Tony's leg until the engineer gave him a tired pat on his claw. He walked forward and accepted the web solution from you. Attaching the Iron Man boots, he flew upwards and released Peter from the ceiling, grabbing him and lowering them both back to the floor. The minute the teen was back on the ground, Tony grabbed a towel and threw it at him. Peter caught it and started wiping off the foam from Dummy's preemptive fire safety measures. Tony sat down and stared at Peter with a single eyebrow raised. Peter shuffled under the gaze. So, can we agree to forget what you just saw? Only if you never speak of the noodle incident ever again. What? At least I didn't cause the building to be evacuated. If you don't agree to this deal, I will post everything that just occurred online for everyone to see. Fine. Tony nodded and gestured to the teen to sit. He leaned forward in his chair and searched Peter's face with his eyes. Peter shifted in his chair before snapping and waving finger guns at Tony. So, what's up? Billionaire sighed but decided not to comment on the finger guns. Obviously someone had been spending too much time on Tumblr. And whatever. So, Peter, the PR department came up with a fantastic idea of how to deal with the Everhart situation. Instead of a press conference, how about a controlled interview? Pepper already has a list of good reporters who wouldn't push you too much, and I would be able to be there. What do you think? Peter blinked in surprise. Oh, yeah, that sounds pretty good. When would it happen? Preferably as soon as possible, but if you're not comfortable yet, I can go make some drama as a distraction. Or I could get one of the Avengers to make some drama. All right, I can get Sam to start reenacting some of those sign things that I caught you watching. Vine. Gesundheit? No, they're called vines. Semantics. Tony tapped his chin and opened his mouth to continue plotting about things he could get the Avengers to do for distractions. Peter interrupted him. I think I can do it. What? The interview. I can do it. Tony glanced at him in concern and nodded. If you're sure. I'm sure. Does Wednesday work for you? Peter smirked. It is Wednesday, my dudes. Ah! Tony's eyes widened as he scooted his chair back. All right, in that case, the interview will be on Tuesday. I can't believe you've done this. Chapter 5. Ticking of a clock sounded from TVs all over. The clock faded into the background and the view became one of a reporter sitting in front of a giant book with the title, A New Era, Meeting the Stark Heir, and a photo of Peter Parker and Tony Stark sitting on a couch and talking to someone animatedly, smiles on both their faces. The reporter smiled at the camera and, with the classic 60 Minutes professional tone of voice, addressed the audience. Good evening, and welcome to the last story of this week's episode of 60 Minutes. We tend to take more time to research events before broadcasting a story, but for these two we made an exception. Recently, WHIH News released a story that revealed the identity of the new heir to Stark Industries, ignoring the plea for respect that the company has asked for when an announcement about an heir was released. Soon afterwards, SI released a statement that an interview would be released to the public soon. That interview, tonight. Picture on the screen changed to a video of the reporter walking into Stark Tower with the camera crew behind her. The glass doors opened up and the view of an elegant modern lobby was shown. An elevator dinged and a greeting was heard coming from the other direction. It turned to show Tony Stark strutting forward with his signature goatee and sunglasses, a smile on his face, and an AC/DC shirt with a blazer thrown over it. He reached out his hand and shook the hand of the reporter who had come to the tower. Waving at the camera crew, he turned them in the direction of the elevators. The view changed to one of Tony Stark and Peter Parker sitting on a couch with the view of a tastefully decorated wall with a fireplace behind them. Tony's sunglasses had come off, and he had an arm nonchalantly slung around the back of the couch. Peter was glancing around awkwardly, sitting a little forward, wearing a shirt that said, I may be nerdy, but only periodically, with nerdy written out via the elements of the periodic table. The view changed to the reporter. Well, to start this out, I love the shirt. It's hilarious. Peter looked down and laughed. He turned to look at Tony with a searching gaze. The billionaire gave him an imperceptible nod, and the teen turned to look at the reporter with a smile on his face. It's one of my favourites. Tony tried to make us wear matching three-piece suits, but Pepper stopped that disaster fast. Tony frowned good-humouredly, with a twinkle in his eye. It would have been legendary. It would have been something. Hey! The reporter laughed. You two seem rather comfortable with each other. Tony snorted. I just got him to stop calling me Mr. Stark. Peter smiled but didn't deign to comment. The reporter continued. Well, for my first question, Peter, what are your feelings around the recent reveal of your identity? The teen frowned and shifted on the couch. I guess I knew deep down that it would come out eventually. I guess I thought that I'd be able to do it on my own terms once I was out of school. I mean, if it had happened that way, I would have totally done a giant imitation of Tony's I am Iron Man speech. I'd stand up at a podium with a bunch of cue cards, dramatically throw them over my shoulder, and then in the Batman voice just say, I'm the Stark heir. And then I would do a mic drop and walk out. Peter took a deep breath, as he hadn't done so at all during his ramble. Tony stared at him incredulously. If that's what you were planning, I'm actually glad that it happened the way it did. It would have been incredible. The view turned back to the reporter, smiling and glancing between the two as they continued their back and forth. She began the next question. So, how did the two of you meet? Tony glanced at Peter and took the question. The first time I met Peter, well, met is the wrong term. We first interacted at the 2010 Stark Expo. Yes, one. The billionaire paused and turned to Peter with his eyebrows raised. Peter looked at him questioningly for a second before realizing that he was passing it to the teen. Oh yeah, so I had on an Iron Man mask and gauntlet, the ones that people would get for Halloween, and one of the hammer drones tried to kill me, but Tony landed next to me and shot the drone. He then proceeded to look at me and say, Nice work, kid, and we flew off. It was the greatest moment of my young life. Tony took over from there. So, long story short, I remembered the incident and did some research to see if the kid made it out okay. I ended up at one of his science fairs looking for potential SI innovators and recognized him. Turns out that not only is this kid a genius, but he also helps out a mutual friend of ours, Spider-Man, with his webbing. I brought him into the compound to give him better equipment and ended up getting attached. The reporter smiled. That certainly is a fantastic story. Dr. Stark, where do you think this will bring the company? Tony started to answer the question while Peter zoned out a bit and started making reaction faces directly into the camera. Tony paused and looked over in confusion at the teen. What are you doing? Peter paused. I'm practicing. In the office, they turn to the camera and are able to communicate all their feelings with just one look. I'm working on that. Tony continued to stare as he nervously laughed. Then he turned to look directly at the camera and gave it a deadpan look before sighing and looking back at his protege. At least it wasn't a vine this time. Peter gasped, and Tony put his face in his hands. You got the name right this time. I'm so proud of you. I'm slowly making you aware of Gen Z and millennial culture. Yes! Tony stared at the reporter and spoke with an annoyed tone. He put lemons inside my cereal boxes. He attacked pigeons on the balcony with a hose, yelling about how it wasn't their land. Those are only 2 examples of the things I've had to put up with. Peter snorted. It's necessary for your education. You called a dap the other day. Tony sighed and Peter tapped him on the arm. Hey, why did you take down Captain America? Tony sighed again, closed his eyes and replied, We shot him in the legs because his shield is the size of a dinner plate and he's an idiot. Peter raised his hands in triumph as Tony tried to cover up a smile. The view transitioned to the reporter sitting in front of the large book again. She smiled at the camera. As many of you know, the Avengers have only recently gotten back together after the events that have been titled the Avengers Civil War over the Sokovia Accords. While at Stark Tower, I took the opportunity to ask both Dr. Stark and Mr. Parker about their experience with the conflict. While Dr. Stark chose not to respond to the question, pointing towards the official press releases, Mr. Parker, however, had an interesting insight into the conflict. The camera was shown pointing at Peter, plainly missing from the couch. The teen flicked his eyes to the corner of the room and fidgeted before looking back at the reporter. I guess the Sokovia Accords situation was interesting for me because we've been following it in my current events class, and I was able to see, close, the situation with the Avengers. The perspective allowed me to be able to look at it objectively as well as emotionally. I feel that the reason it went south fast was no one really talked it out with each other, and by the time it had finished, no one wanted to talk it out because everyone was hurt in more ways than one. The reporter nodded and gestured her pen at him. Do you think that, with plans for the Avengers, the conflict may be resolved? Peter frowned and thought about the question for a second before slowly nodding. I don't think that it will ever go back to the way it was. But I do think that, if they think about the context of everyone's reactions and hash it out, some semblance of the way it was may be achievable. The video of Peter faded into the background as the photo on the book with the reporter in front. She clasped her hands together. Wise words from a teen with a very large future in front of him. This brings us to the end of today's broadcast. Visit 60 Minutes Overtime to hear our interview with the CEO of SI, Pepper Potts, on the future of Stark Industries and how Mr. Parker might shape it. This has been 60 Minutes. The titular clock appeared and the ticking started to play. The last tick sounded and it faded from the screens. The beginning of a new era.
Chapter 6. Many weeks later, Tony sat in an office, tapping a pen and staring at the woman sitting across from him, Aunt May. He leaned forward and placed both hands on the table. Tony, my apartment has paparazzi stationed outside of it, and Peter has to go back to school soon. I know that our original plan was to have him stay with you for the summer and come back during the school year, but I honestly don't think that it would be safe for him to come back to the apartment. Tony tapped the pencil on the desk one last time before sitting up and copying May's pose. I'm actually glad that you came to see me because I was going to bring up the same topic. How about you and Peter come and permanently move into the tower? I can have transport and a security escort arranged for him when he goes to school. Much to Tony's surprise, May closed her eyes and took a deep breath in, rather than having a more extreme reaction to the idea. The billionaire cocked his head to the side, wondering what she was about to say. She opened her eyes and looked towards the corner of the room. Did you know that I never officially adopted Peter? Yes. Technically, I'm just his guardian. You know, I thought that I could do it, but once we earned enough income to support our family, Ben and I would make it permanent. Then Ben died, Peter got powers, and now this. I don't know what to do, Tony. I love this kid with all my heart, but I know that I'm not the person that can help him. The billionaire froze. What are you trying to say? Do you see the way he looked at you? He was hero, and I know that you see him as your own. What I'm trying to say is, I don't think that staying with me will help him the most. I was wondering if you would take guardianship, or even partial guardianship, over Peter. I can't help him with all of this, but I know that you can. Will you at least think about it? Tony stared in shock at May, his mouth gaping. May continued, I'll even go talk to him about it right now if I have to. This kid has gone through too much. The least I can do is try and make it so that he's in the best position to succeed. If that means I have to be out of the way, then I'll get out of the way. Tony leaned forward in his chair, eyes focusing dangerously on May. I sure as hell do not want you to up and abandon this kid. You said it yourself. He's been through too much. You can't just leave him. Then what should I do, Tony? Move into the tower. I've already thought it out. There's a bunch of guest suites open from when the Avengers moved out. I can have all your stuff delivered here by tomorrow, before Pete has to go back to school. Look, I completely understand thinking that an option has to be one of two options, but I've found that it's usually best if you can come to a compromise. Thinking on either side of an extremity is dangerous. If the option still stands for us to have joint custody over Peter, then I would run and call my lawyers right away, because that kid means a lot to me, and I would love to make it more official. Don't think that you have to leave for that to happen. He loves you, and you love him, and I don't want to see either of you hurt. Tony had turned to trace the veins of wood in his desk while speaking, but as he finished he looked up to the sight of May crying, hand over her mouth. His eyebrows shot up and he slowly sat up, hand reaching forward to awkwardly pat May's other hand that was resting on the desk. Hey, no, don't do that. He wiped her face and sniffed. Sorry, I don't want to leave him. You don't have to. All right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to call Happy, and he's going to arrange for your stuff to get moved out of your apartment and into one of the suites. Peter's room is on my level, but I'm sure he could move down. No, that's not necessary. I'm gone most of the time because of my shifts at work, and I'd rather have Peter with you than with empty rooms. Tony smiled, a small sense of victory in his chest. He hadn't wanted to part with the kid, even by a floor or two, but he had been willing. The Avenger stood up from his desk and grabbed his phone, slipping it into a pocket. Let's go talk to Peter.
May stood up and followed him as he walked out of the door, asking Friday where the kid had gotten to. He's in the staff cafeteria, boss. Birdman is with him. Birdman? You told me to call Mr. Wilson that exactly 4 days and 57 seconds ago. Oh, right. Yeah. What are they doing in the staff cafeteria? I'd rather not say. Tony's eyebrows flew up as he turned towards May. I think it would be best if we hurried. The two raced towards the elevator, speeding down until, with a quiet bing, the door slid open, revealing an empty cafeteria with two figures standing next to the drink selection area. Peter was grinning from ear to ear, clutching his phone as Sam filled up as fast as he could, with the selections of all the drinks, took a sip, and looked directly into the camera. F you. Much to the dismay of the two, Friday kept playing an automated beeping noise whenever they said the expletive. Hall monitor protocols were still in place. The two giggled and turned to watch the recording. Bent over the phone, neither noticed that Tony and May were approaching until May cleared her throat loudly. They turned to the sight of Tony and May standing with eyebrows raised and arms crossed. Sam started to panic. Nope, I'm out of here. Your situation is too dangerous for me. Falcon ran towards the door to the balcony, swinging them open and yelling, You're on your own, kid, before jumping off the side of the building and flying away. Peter waved. Bye, Sam. The teen turned back to the two in front of him and crossed his arms, leaning casually against the drink selection machine. Hey, what are you two doing here? Tony and May exchanged a glance before Tony drawled. Looking for you. What are you doing here? The teen mumbled something. May leaned forward, a hand cupping her ear. I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Well, Sam and I were reenacting the Vine. Both May and Tony sighed at the same time before Tony pulled out a chair that was settled at one of the cafeteria tables and gestured for Peter to sit down in it. The teen gracelessly slid into it, fidgeting as May and Tony sat across from him. May smiled at Peter. So, Peter, Tony and I have been talking. You know that school is coming up, and we've been discussing some options. We've decided that, due to the drama of the last few weeks, we're going to officially move into the tower. Wait, really? That's so cool. May raised a hand placatingly. We've also decided that, if we get your permission, Tony and I will share guardianship over you. That way we can both be at our best and try to help you succeed. Peter sat back in the chair, eyes wide. Tony leaned forward. If you want to think about it for a bit, that's okay by me. Peter shook his head. No, I don't need to think about it. I'd really like that. Both of you. Both of you mean so much to me, and I'd really like that. Tony and May broke out into smiles and stood up from the table. Peter met them halfway for a group hug. They separated and stood back before the smile dropped from Tony's face. Oh no, I need to go tell Pepper. The Avenger rushed off, phone in hand, towards the elevator. May and Peter watched him go, Aunt May frowning. Is that going to be a problem? No, Tony just forgets to tell her things and then she gets pissed. After what happened the last time, let's just say that he's been really on top of the whole sharing information thing. Sounds about right.
Chapter 7. The car slid through the traffic of New York. Happy swore profusely at the other drivers, while Tony and Peter sat in the back. Aunt May, though she now lived in the tower with them, still had the same work schedule. Tony had volunteered to accompany Peter to the first day of school for the year. Peter's backpack sat in his lap, and he fidgeted with the straps. Tony looked up at him and turned to face the teen. Peter, hey, look at me. Peter turned to face him. So, kiddo, I've been meaning to have this chat with you for a while now. This seems like a good time. The billionaire closed his eyes and took a breath before patting Peter on the shoulder. I didn't want people to find out about you until you were in college at the very least. I'm sorry that all of this happened. Peter opened his mouth to protest, but Tony raised a hand up to stop him from talking. We can't change what happened, so the best thing I can do is to prepare you for what will happen. People are going to act differently around you, Pete. Some people are going to be aggressive, but the most dangerous to you are the ones who will suddenly be nicer to you. I had a lot of heartbreaks when I was your age for that very reason. The best advice I can give you is to judge people by how they acted before, and don't push away your real friends. Peter looked up at Tony with a scared look in his eyes. I don't know if I can do this. Tony leaned forward and wrapped his arms around the teen. I know you can do this. You're Spider-Man, and you're also the closest thing I have to a son. I believe in you. May believes in you. I know the Avengers definitely do. Besides, if anything happens, you can always call me or any of the other Avengers. Happy glanced back in the mirror and spoke up. Sorry to interrupt, but we're here. The car pulled up to the curb and a swarm of reporters automatically pointed their cameras towards them. Tony reached into his pocket and pulled out an extra pair of sunglasses. Sliding them onto Peter's face, he grinned. Now you look like a Stark. Go get him, kiddo. Happy got out of the driver's seat and walked around to open the door. With one last look at Tony, who was sending him a thumbs up, Peter slid out of the car and walked up the steps, Happy's hand on his back, as the bodyguard rushed him through the crowd of reporters, who were all yelling questions and flashing their cameras. For some reason, the flashes of light weren't as intense as they usually were. Did Tony add something to the glasses? It didn't matter for now. He could interrogate Mr. Tony later. They made it through the doors and stopped. Happy turned to look at the teen and gave him one short nod before walking back out. Peter grinned. Thanks, Happy. As the bodyguard walked out the door, Peter turned around to the sight of his classmates staring at him and whispering to each other. Look, it's him. I bet he's really Stark's son, but they're just covering it up. He is kind of attractive. It's too bad that he's, so weird. Peter listened, frozen in place as all the comments washed over him. Footsteps to his right. A group of people who had never interacted with him outside of sneers walked by. There were 2 girls and 1 guy. The guy waved. Hey, Peter, right? We were wondering if you wanted to hang out with us today. The guys and I were going to shoot some hoops with these fine ladies at lunch today. Peter cringed. Oh, no, sorry, I can't. Peter! Ned's voice shot across the room and Peter exhaled in relief. Waving awkwardly at the group, he zoomed over to his best friend. Thank you so much for saving me. No problem. So, hey, what's it like? Have you met the Avengers? I haven't heard from you very much this summer, and I was getting worried. Peter frowned, taking off the sunglasses as they made it to his locker. He slipped his stuff inside, grabbing the materials for his classes. I'm sorry, with all the stuff that happened this summer, went by really quickly, and it was a mess. No apologies, I get it. So I got a hold of the Isengard Lego set, and I was wondering if you wanted to come over and build it. Peter gasped and smiled brilliantly at his friend. Really? Of course. I'll have to ask Tony, but I'm sure he'll say it's okay. Dude, that's so weird. What? You saying I'll have to ask Tony? Peter shook his head and laughed. Yeah. They both left their first class with waves and promises to see each other at lunch. Thankfully, the first class went fine for Peter. It was science. Working in the lab with Tony really made the class seem more boring than usual, but he made it through. Some of the teachers for his classes treated him like they always did. Others pulled him over to the side and asked if it would be possible to see if Peter could get Tony to come in as a speaker one day. He answered with vague responses. Finally, it was lunchtime. He grabbed food and walked over to where he always sat with Ned and MJ. The other 2 hadn't arrived yet. Pulling out his phone, he bit into an apple while reading the texts running across the screen. Tony. Hey kid, I hope you're doing good. I'll pick you up at 3. Red Tesla. Elon's been bugging me about using his car. Peter grinned and typed a response. Peter. All good so far. TTYL. Tony. TTYL better not stand for Tony totally yeets lobster. Peter. Did you just use the word yeet? Tony, smiley face. Peter, OMG. Someone sat across from him, and he looked up from the phone into the angry eyes of none other than Flash Thompson. He placed the phone on the table and raised an eyebrow at the other student. Flash glared. I just wanted to let you know that just because you're Stark's bastard doesn't mean that you can get away with anything. Peter took a deep breath and channeled Tony. I don't know, Flash. Aren't you the one who should be afraid of what one can and can't get away with? The bully stood up and opened his mouth. The hand landed on his shoulder before he could say anything. MJ stood behind Flash, staring daggers at him. I don't think this is where you usually sit. Shouldn't you go off and bother someone else? The bully glared at her, knocking her hand off his shoulder, and pushed past, grumbling about Peter. Peter looked at MJ with a dazzling grin. Hey, thank you so much for that. It looked like you could have handled it, but I wasn't going to take any chances. Ned came running up behind and slid into the other seat. I'm so sorry I'm late. Boy, do I have a story to tell you. Lunch passed peacefully after that, and soon the day was done. Peter found himself standing in the foyer of the school, staring at the crowd of reporters waiting outside. Tony was somewhere on the other side of that crowd. He slipped the sunglasses on his face as Ned and MJ slid up next to him. MJ narrowed her eyes. Do you need me to fight them for you? Ned gasped. You can't go around fighting people. But I would totally join in. The two turned to look at Peter. Both of you need to catch the subway. You don't need to stay with me. MJ smiled. It's too bad I already came up with a distraction plan. Right as she said that, the reporters started shouting as 5 students wearing inflatable T-Rex outfits came charging at them. In the chaos, MJ pushed Peter out the doors and past the reporters, leaving Ned behind him with a wave and a promise to call him. They jogged down the steps towards the red Tesla, with the unmistakable sight of Tony Stark sitting inside it. The billionaire was laughing at the sight of the reporters being taken out by inflatable dinosaurs. They made it to the car. Peter opened the door and paused to look at MJ. How did you do that? A few nerds owed me a favor. See you tomorrow. The team walked away, and Tony pulled the car out of the lineup of parents. The reporters looked up just in time to see them go and swore at their misfortune. The inflatable dinosaur skipped off, their job done. Tony looked over at Peter and smiled. How was the day, kid? The teen returned the smile. Good.
Chapter 8. Steve Rogers sat on the couch in the compound, Bucky snuggled up next to him. They were alone in the living room. The compound always seemed empty. No one was ever around. Steve didn't know how he could have continued to with the split without Wakanda's help. Princess Yuri had wiped Hydra's programming out of Bucky's mind. He didn't have the original Bucky back, probably never would, but this was better than nothing. They were watching some documentary show. On screen was a chase scene between a lizard and a bunch of snakes. Steve was rooting for the lizard. The smooth British voice was suddenly interrupted by an abrupt American one from right behind them. The lizard dies. The two turned around to look at Sam, standing behind the couch and oh so innocently slurping out of a juice box. Bucky raised an eyebrow. Instead of responding to the sarcasm that is represented by an eyebrow raise, Sam started gesturing towards the screen. Look, look. Turning around, the two soldiers were greeted to the sight of the lizard being eaten by one of the snakes. Sam started cackling evilly as he rushed out of the room, singing Circle of Life. Bucky drawled, That's too bad. The lizard was starting to grow on me. Steve opened his mouth to reply, but he was stopped by his phone buzzing on from the table next to the couch. There was a text from Brody. Mark your calendar. Meeting at the Schwarma place, Saturday at 11. Bring your friend. J.R. Bucky leaned over. What's up? The super soldier typed an affirmative response and turned towards his friend. Have you ever had shawarma? Wanda threw a punch towards the spy, who caught it and twisted. He yelped and jumped backwards, arms up in defence. Natasha struck Wanda in the chest with a well-aimed kick, and Wanda fell to the ground with a groan. Wanda whacked her hand down on the mat and moaned, "I yield." The spy stood back and walked out of the ring. "You can't always rely on your magic. You need to learn how to defend yourself." I know, I just... Wanda's comment went unheard as the sound of 2 buzzing phones came from where their street clothes were lying. The 2 walked over and checked their phones. Meeting at the shawarma place, Saturday at 11. JR. Wanda looked down, confused. Shawarma place? The spy laughed. It's a long story. The Eagles are coming. Brody wants everyone to meet at the shawarma place, Saturday at 11. You both just got out of house arrest, right? Lego lass. Hell yes. Tic-tac. Shawarma place. Lego lass. Long story. The Eagles are coming. I have no idea what it means either. Is this an original cliche thing? Lego lass. Yeah. Tic-tac. I can't make it. I promised that I'd see Cassie this weekend. The Eagles are coming. That's fine. Technically, you're not an Avenger, to be honest. Legolas. Ooh, burn. Tic-tac. Sam, I came here to have a good time, and honestly, I'm feeling so attacked right now. Tony and Rhodey sat in the lab. The engineer was elbows deep into the Iron Man suit, while the colonel was ranting about some general who pissed him off. Footsteps sounded behind them as they turned to the sight of Peter walking into the lab. Ned's awestruck face peered around the doorframe. Peter held up a phone. Hey, Rhodey, you forgot your phone upstairs. He handed the phone to the colonel and stood there awkwardly for a second before Tony looked up from the armor. Hey, so you know how you're telling me about that shawarma place the Avengers went to after the Battle of New York? I was wondering if we could go try it this Saturday at 11. The engineer narrowed his eyes. That's oddly specific. Well, you were saying Vision would be in town, and I figured we could go do something fun. I made reservations already. Tony leaned back his chair and examined the teen. All right. Rhodey's coming too, right? Yeah. The colonel made eye contact with Tony before shrugging. Sure, why not? Tony leaned to look past Peter at the starstruck face of Ned. Hey, Ted. Ned's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Yeah, definitely. Peter interrupted. All right, sounds good. I'm going to head out then. All right, be back by 10. The teens walked out the room. Rhodey looked at Tony and whacked his arm. Ow, hey. You are such a dad. Tony glared at Rhodey, but didn't deny the comment. The kid is a parasite. True. Well, are you excited for shawarma? Tony's eyebrows rose. Judging by the fact that the shawarma place doesn't take reservations, something other than shawarma is being planned. Be vigilant. Will do. Chapter 9. Tony walked into the living room of his penthouse to the sight of Rhodey and Vision chatting calmly, civilian clothes on, Tony's tech wrapping Rhodey's legs. They looked up at the sound of his footsteps. Tony walked over to Vision and clapped a hand on his shoulder. Good to have you back. How was the vacation? He tilted his head towards Tony. It was very educational. I find myself with a greater appreciation for human nature. I do hope that the return of our old teammates has not been too hard on you. Colonel Rhodes has kept me up to date with the new developments. Tony turned a glare towards Rhodey. Really, Platypus? Talking about me behind my back? Rhodey scoffed. Oh, like you were going to tell him. Silence reigned momentarily before Tony sniffed. Granted. Before anyone else could make another comment, the sound of people chanting, Bill, 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 echoed throughout the room. Tony whipped out his phone and opened the text. The kid's going to meet us there, apparently. Rhodey frowned at the phone. What even was that ringtone? Tony had become engrossed in texting Peter as many emojis as he could, so Vision took it upon himself to answer. I do believe that the chanting of the name Bill is part of the intro to a show known as Bill Nye the Science Guy, popular among American youths. Oh, all right. That explains why Tony has it as a ringtone. Tones, why is that your ringtone? Tony looked up and slid the phone into a pocket. Peter and I binged watched the show. He's really into it. Vision frowned. Peter? The other two looked up in confusion before Tony's eyes widened in realization. Oh, you never officially met him. The Spider Kid. Spider-Man. My protege. Have you not watched the news recently? It was a huge story. Really annoying, but still huge. I have not. Well, the kid's a riot. You'll love him. Rhodey rolled his eyes in exasperation before ushering Tony and Vision out of the building and towards the restaurant. As they neared the place, they noticed that the blinds over the windows had been closed, obscuring the view of the inside. The sign that rested on the door said, "Closed for private event." Tony sighed. I knew he was doing something. All right, let's get this show on the road. He walked forward, the other two right behind him, and swung the door open. The three stood in shock at the view in front of them as the door closed behind them. A large circular table sat in the middle of the room, food scattered across it. A projector hung from the ceiling, showing a hastily put-together PowerPoint presentation. And the majority of the persons who participated in the Civil War were sitting in silence and staring at each other. Well, everyone except Scott and T'Challa. Scott was spending the weekend with Cassie, and Peter had been unsuccessful in contacting T'Challa. His attempt to give Ned's computer a virus that played an ominous chant, "You better watch out, you better watch out, you better watch out, you better watch out," every time Ned clicked the letter B. Everyone turned to look up at Tony, Rhodey, and Vision. Peter waved from where he was standing in front of the projector screen. Hey, Dad, Tony. Colonel Rhodes, Vision. Yes, have a seat. The three glanced around before sitting down across from Steve and Bucky. Sam and Natasha were closest to the new arrivals, with Wanda and Clint sitting on Bucky's other side. Wanda shot a questioning glance at Vision. Clint stuck his thumb out at Peter once everyone had finished greeting one another with stiff nods. Who is this kid, and what are we doing here? Peter puffed up. I'm Spider-Man. Clint's eyebrows raised before turning to look at Tony. Tony, oh my God, you brought him to fight us? He glared across the table. Fight me, Barton. Oh, I will. Hey! Peter's voice bounced around the room, cutting off the argument that was about to ensue. Do you want to know why you're here or not? Steve nodded after exchanging a glance with Bucky. Go ahead, kid. Peter looked towards Tony, who gave him the universal "do continue" hand gesture. All right, so when Tony and I had that 60 Minutes interview, question about the Sokovia Accords got me thinking that none of you heard all the sides of the story, like Paul. So I was thinking that we could try and talk it out peacefully and see what can be done about that. I even brought some of the conversational propaganda from all the times my school has tried to get us to bond. Sighs were uttered from all across the table as everyone shifted their gazes to watch the others' reactions. Well, everyone but Sam, who was happily munching on the schwarma. Peter picked up a hat full of small pieces of paper and shook them around, his other hand clicking a remote that changed the slide to a page that said, "Communication is key," in overly edited font. He grinned wickedly as he pulled the name from out of the hat. For the first round, you're going to have 1 to 2 minutes to talk about why you did what you did. Remember that this is a safe space. He looked down and read the name. The first one up is Natasha. The spy stared him down before sighing. I was trying to keep us together. I made mistakes. That's it. I've already apologized to those who needed one. Peter checked his watch. That wasn't a minute, but all right, Spider Buddies. I'll let you get away with it. He picked the next name out of the hat. Next is Tony. Tony glared at Peter. I'm disowning you. No, you're not. We'll see about that. Peter widened his eyes and frowned sadly. Please? No. Please? Fine. Everyone turned to look at him expectantly. He glared out at the table from under the sunglasses that sat perched on his nose. I had been notified of the Accords early on, and had already contacted my team of lawyers to begin the process for adding amendments into it. After the events with Ultron, I realized that we needed to be put into check, because we were starting to be just as dangerously unaccountable as my weapons were. Wanda muttered under her breath at the mention of his weapons. He glared at her quickly before continuing. I ran the calculations, and the Accords were the best option in front of us. I didn't expect everything to devolve the way it did. I certainly didn't expect to have to fight the team that I cared about. I also didn't expect for someone to have lied to me for years about a personal tragedy that really messed me up. So there. That's why I did what I did. He sat back in his chair, arms crossed. Rhodey patted him on the leg while Peter shot him a blinding smile. Peter grabbed the next name. Bucky. The soldier shifted and leaned into the arm that Steve had slung over his shoulder. I didn't mean to get mixed up in this. I'm real sorry about what happened. He looked at Tony. About everything I've done. He went silent and Peter awkwardly picked the next name. Wanda. She glared at Tony and spat out. I wasn't going to let my parents' murderer get away with imprisoning me. Peter, to everyone's surprise, groaned loudly. I promised myself that I would try to remain impartial, but no, can't do it. He placed the hat on the table. I had a friend of mine hack into the Stark Industries archive. Hey, it's your fault for giving me the Wi-Fi password. Anyways, we tracked the weapons shipment and the one that landed on your home was sold under the table. Tony had nothing to do with it. He turned to stare at Peter. What? Tony didn't kill your parents. He looked down at the table before standing up and backing away from the group. I need to go. She briskly walked out of the restaurant, the door closing behind her. Peter pulled another name out of the hat. Clint, your turn. Clint set down the shawarma and wiped his hands with a napkin. Cap called me and said that Tony had locked Wanda in the compound. I went to rescue her. It devolved from there. End of story. All right, Sam. Come on, man, you know for a fact that I've already talked this out with everyone. Fine, you get a pass. Sam did a fist bump and went back to eating. Steve. He raised his head and confidently began to speak. I had to save Bucky and I couldn't let the Avengers be controlled by the government. I wasn't told that it was possible to change the Accords to what they are now. You do realize that the United Nations is technically an organization and not a government, right? He asked. Yes. Did you actually read the Accords before fighting everyone? Not really. Wow. Tony snorted. I thought you were trying to be impartial, Pete. Peter flung his hands in the air in frustration. I can't help it. It's too ignorant not to comment on it. He turned back to Steve. Is that all you're going to say? No other defense? Steve sniffed. I've said all I needed to. Bucky rolled his eyes at the obstinate sitting next to him. Peter pulled the next name out. Vision, you're up. Vision placed his hands together on the table and looked around the room. I ran the calculations and the Accord seemed like the best option. I acted according to those calculations. Oh hey, it's me now. Peter took a deep breath before embarking on his statement. So Mr. Stark randomly showed up at my apartment and was like, hey, want to go to Germany? And I was all like, yeah, cool. He didn't really tell me what was going on, like current events class. Then we all fought each other, which was really awesome. Awful. So that's my story. Natasha smirked at him. Eloquently put. I like how you said all of that in one breath. Tony grinned. That's my kid. Peter smiled. Colonel Rhodes, your turn. It was the right thing to do. Being in the Air Force taught me a thing or two about bureaucracy, and the Accords was the only solution that would have healed the problems evident in the system. I thought it through. I know that Tony thought it through, and I stand by my actions. The room went silent, with various people nodding in affirmation as they all turned to look at Peter. The tune shifted. Oh, right. I guess we're done now. I have to say, Tony was the only one who went with the whole 1 to 2 minutes thing, so shame on the rest of you. The only thing next to do is UIADS. A chorus of no's were shouted across the room. In that case, you're all free to go and reflect about everything you've heard today. Feel free to take some food with you. The Avengers each stood and grabbed some of the food off the table, heading out the door by themselves or in pairs until it was just Tony and Peter in the restaurant. Peter cast his eyes at the ground as Tony walked over to him. The billionaire frowned and put a finger under his chin. Hey, kiddo, look at me. What's up? Peter sniffed. Was that okay? I was so miserable every time that the whole situation came up, and I wanted to try and make it better. Tony paused a second before embracing Peter, who returned the hug instantly. You did good, kid. You did good. I never thought that any of us would be able to sit in the same room and do what you just made us do. At the very least, we should be able to moderately stand each other now. Peter sniffed into his shirt, and Tony paused, frown flitting across his face. Hey, who's paying for this? Peter giggled. You are. That's it, I'm disowning you. No, you're not. Tony smiled. No, I'm not.
The word I'm looking for. Book 3. Masquerading as a Man with a Reason by TinyButFierce. Rhodey would like to say that his 15-year-old roommate was quiet and spent the weekends diligently studying and not causing havoc across campus. He would like to say it hadn't become his job to wrangle a hungover teenager to their morning classes, dragging him out of whatever hole he found himself in and pumping him full of unreasonable amounts of coffee. He would like to say that Tony remembered things that had happened the night before, instead of unhelpful snippets of information. Monday mornings were the worst for the two MIT students. They both had an 8 o'clock class that consisted of the professor playing with equipment while everyone took notes and tried not to fall asleep. Rhodey settled Tony in a seat towards the back of the classroom, and the teen slid sunglasses onto his face and guzzled down coffee. The other students filtered into the class, and the sound of chatter filled the room. Tony looked towards Rhodey and whacked his arm. Hey, do you have any food on you? Rhodey glared at the teen. I have a singular granola bar that would act as my breakfast because, unlike someone, I actually care about my well-being. Besides, I'm sure you ate something last night, right? Tony made a groaning noise. I vaguely remember making ramen noodles, but I don't think I ate them. Is that all you remember? Pretty much, yeah. Before Rhodey could respond, the professor walked into the room and the students fell silent. Good morning, class. I'm in the mood to get this started right away. How about you? Murmurs of assent were vocalized. Great. The professor gestured towards the equipment that was set up to the side of the classroom and began to ramble about some type of chemistry experiment that could only be done in a clean environment. The professor grabbed a beaker full of water and prepared to pour it into the equipment. Tony sat up in alarm, obviously remembering something. He turned to look at Rhodey and whispered, Sodium! What are you talking about? Sodium! At that moment, the teacher poured the water into the equipment and, much to his surprise, white gas started to pour out of the top with the sound of an explosion. The explosion caused the equipment to dismantle and started rolling around the room. The sprinklers began to go off as students started grabbing things and running out of the room while the alarm blared, only worsening Tony's hangover. The professor grabbed a fire extinguisher and sprayed the room with it, stopping the fire. Unfortunately, he wasn't fast enough to stop the alarms. The whole room became crowded with students evacuating the premises. Tony and Rhodey went along with the panicking students and joined the crowd outside, watching while the fire trucks pulled up and swarmed the building. One of the higher-up professors called for the attention of the crowd. Due to the incident, you are free for the rest of the day. I would like to say that, whoever did this, will be looking over the security tapes to discover the culprit. Rhodey looked over at Tony, who gulped nervously. He grabbed Tony's arm and pulled him away from the crowd, who watched the fireman assessing the condition of the building. Dragging him limply back to their dorm room, he locked the door behind them and crossed his arms, glaring at the teen who flopped down onto his bed. Did you have anything to do with this? No. Then why did you whisper about sodium for no reason? I'm going to ask again. Did you have anything to do with this? Maybe? Rhodey sat down on his bed and sighed, steepling his fingers under his chin. Tony sighed and flipped around so that his head was resting on his pillow. He suddenly frowned and sat up, looking down at the pillow. Rhodey noticed the action and raised an eyebrow. What is it, Tones? There's something under here. The teen reached down and lifted the pillow up, revealing an object that both students paused and stared at in shock. Tony, are those the security tapes? Did you steal the security tapes? Looks like it. We're watching them. Much to Tony's protest, Rhodey did, in fact, manage to set up an apparatus to watch the tapes. It happened like this.
A very drunk teenage Tony Stark managed to wander into the lab, thinking that it was the kitchen in their dorm room. He then proceeded to try and cook a lot of ramen within the very apparatus that the professor was going to use the next day. After finally figuring out that the equipment he had dumped the ramen in was not, in fact, a microwave or stove, Tony left it there. Instead of cleaning up his mess, in his infinite wisdom, he decided to steal the security tapes that showed the incident very clearly. A single serving of ramen noodles has about 875 milligrams of sodium in it. Sodium in its pure form reacts explosively in the presence of water. The equipment that Tony had dumped the ramen into was one whose job it is to separate components and mixtures into pure form. Therefore, the sodium that had been separated out from the ramen had exploded and started to burn in the presence of the water that the professor had poured into the equipment. After viewing the tapes, Tony proceeded to smash them with a hammer and incinerate them. The MIT staff never did figure out what happened, aside from the slight odour of cooking ramen noodles that stayed for weeks. Rhodey vowed never to forget the incident. He never knew when he would need to embarrass Tony in the future. In the meantime, he confiscated Tony's stash of ramen noodles. He will also admit to holding the incident over his head whenever the teen got an idea that was particularly bad. It's always good to have some blackmail.
The word I'm looking for. 4. I was soaring ever higher by TinyButFierce. A ship sped through the stars towards a small blue planet on the horizon. The ship was not a war vessel, it was full of refugees. Refugees who needed a new home and were clinging to their leaders' connections on that small blue planet. The ship slowed down as it approached, stopping itself a good distance away from the planet. They couldn't enter a sustained orbit, but the primitive planet had multitudes of circling objects that would be disrupted if the ship, a good size bigger than those small objects, were to come up at a close range. The smaller ship undocked from the vessel and streamed its way towards the small blue planet, entering the atmosphere, flying down towards a city of rising skyscrapers. The ship angled itself towards one specific building. This building had a landing pad for a ship their size, and it just so happened that they knew the owner. Surely he would be fine with their unauthorized landing. The occupants of the craft noted, with some interest, that all the letters of the owner's name had been added back to the side of the building. Surely nothing too drastic had occurred in their absence. The minute that their ship dropped onto the landing pad, silent alarms were triggered throughout the building. Thankfully, it was the weekend, so the only people present in the majority of the levels were security guards, who noted the alarm with interest. The presence of superpowered individuals in the area made alarms a regular occurrence. At least they didn't have to evacuate yet. There was one individual who didn't classify as a security guard, though. Usually, there would be more. The family that lived towards the top of the tower stayed at home more than not. On this particular weekend, however, all of the adult presence was away at work, be it as a CEO, nurse, or a superhero fighting with his team somewhere in the Midwest. Peter Parker was in his room tinkering with an Iron Man gauntlet when the alarms went off. Normally, he would have been working on his web shooters. No, his web shooters were in his backpack that he had accidentally left at Ned's house the day before. So he had to make do. Not that an Iron Man gauntlet was somehow less interesting than his web shooters. It was just a little more dangerous, which, he had to admit, did make it more exciting at least. His inner child was still freaking out, though. Moments before the alarm had gone off, he tensed, feeling like something was about to happen. Then it did. At least he had a weapon with him. Why did it always have to be an Iron Man gauntlet whenever things like this happened? If this kept happening, Tony was going to think he was trying to steal his job. Friday chimed in with the alarm. An unauthorized craft has landed. An alert has been sent to Boss, and he is currently changing course towards the tower, citing that the other Avengers can deal with the swarm of large moths. The craft appears to be extraterrestrial in origin. I would recommend staying put until the situation resolves. Peter stood up from his desk
and slid the gauntlet onto his hand. Friday, how could you just ask me to just chill here while I could go see aliens? The teen started to creep towards the good door, gauntlet at the ready. Mini-boss, I would advise against this action. Peter swung the door open quietly, gauntlet held out in front, and quietly apologized to Friday, who told him that she was alerting Tony to his actions. He winced. No doubt he'd hear some words about this later. The hallway was clear. He crept down the side, aware that Friday was tracking his every movement. He made it to the end of the hallway and quickly flipped around the corner to the sight of the empty living room and the craft sitting on the other side of the glass. The craft looked worn down, definitely alien in origin. As Peter was looking at the ship, the ramp lowered down and he could see 3 sets of legs start to walk down the incline. He watched as the figures came into better view. He didn't recognize the one on the far left, but she looked like someone he did not want to mess with. The other 2, though, he knew them. He knew them and he was pissed. With a burst of fury, he stalked through the living room and threw the door to the landing strip open. The 3 people came to a stop as Peter raised the activated gauntlet towards them. Valkyrie reached for her sword, but paused when Thor waved his hand to stop her action. Bruce, standing on the other side of Thor, immediately raised his hands in the air and stared at Peter with a bewildered expression. Thor straightened up and said, "Seek the man of iron and intend you no harm. Would you be knowledgeable as to his whereabouts?" Peter glared at the group and pointed at Thor and Bruce. "You left." Thor frowned. "I'm not quite sure of what you speak, but—" Bruce whacked Thor on the arm and leaned his head towards Peter, face contorted in a shocked yet also questioning expression. He loudly whispered, "Tony?" Peter's eyebrows shot up in surprise, and Thor leaned back, praising Peter with a new eye. "That cannot be the man of iron," Thor said. Bruce nodded his head up and down and said, "Tony wouldn't let anyone else operate his personal armor." Valkyrie chimed in, "I'm just here for the booze." Peter, glad for a change in topic from what was a particularly weird accusation, answered the lady with the sword. "There isn't any alcohol on these levels, but there might be some lower in the tower." A gasp sounded from Bruce, and Thor frowned. "No spirits in the home of the man of iron? Something is certainly amiss." Bruce started walking slowly towards Peter, hands still in the air as the gauntlet pointed towards him. Did you get de-aged, Tony?" Right before Peter could respond with a rightfully confused exclamation, the telltale sound of the full Iron Man suit came echoing towards the group. Tony landed in front of Peter, shielding him with his body, and pointed his repulsors towards the group of 3. The mask flipped down to show Tony's face. To anyone who didn't know him, he would appear confident as well as aggressive. To Peter, he looked sad and maybe a little wounded. "Bruce, point break." Tony looked over at Valkyrie. "Scary sword lady. What are you doing back on our humble planet, and what did you do to make my kid threaten you?" A chorus of oohs met his question. Thor nodded towards Peter. "It is good to meet you, son of Stark. Your father is a valiant warrior." Tony snorted. "I'm surprised that Peter here isn't freaking out right now. He's a big fan of yours." The Iron Man suit dispersed back into the holding cell, resting on Tony's chest as Peter walked forward. "I'm freaking out inside. I was stuck between the decision to be mad at all of these peeps for heading off to space and leaving you to deal with the fallout of everything that happened, or to start screaming really loud and jump up and down and request a bunch of selfies because, oh my god, Bruce Banner and Thor are standing right in front of me, and I love them, but I'm also mad at them, and I'm so conflicted." Everyone stared at Peter, astonished that he had said all of that in about one breath. Thor laughed. "Hey, I can see the resemblance. Now, man of iron, I must speak with you." Tony and Thor walked off towards a meeting room, leaving Peter to accommodate Bruce and Valkyrie. The 3 were left in the living room, Bruce staring at Peter with a sliver of shock in his eyes, as Valkyrie stood with her arms crossed. The teen slid the Iron Man gauntlet off of his hand and placed it on the coffee table. So, can I get either of you something to drink? Alcohol, Valkyrie said. Bruce followed her statement with a quiet request for water. Friday chimed in from above, causing both Bruce and Valkyrie to jump. I have completed a scan for alcohol, and there is none present in the tower. Might I recommend the delicacy known as chocolate milk? Valkyrie eyed the ceiling, looking from where the voice was coming from, hand on her sword. If that's what you recommend. Peter smiled and started heading towards the kitchen. Thanks, Friday. My pleasure, mini-boss. Once Peter returned to the group with their drinks, he handed the chocolate milk to Valkyrie, and they watched as the warrior took a sip. She looked up and nodded. This is acceptable. Peter fist-pumped, and Bruce looked bewildered. Valkyrie sat down on the couch and continued to drink her chocolate milk, while Bruce leaned over to talk to Peter. So, Peter, right? What was the old? I don't remember Tony having a kid from before I left. Have I been gone longer than I thought, or have you been around but we didn't know about you? Speaking of, where are the other Avengers? Oh, Peter said. Tony's not actually my biological dad. We met a few years ago when I got an internship at SI. So don't worry, he wasn't hiding me from you. Other Avengers are apparently fighting giant moths somewhere in the Midwest, but I probably won't be around for a while, because they'll have to debrief with the Accords Committee once the battle is done. Bruce frowned. Accords? Yeah, Peter said. The Accords. It's a long story, but the short and sweet version is that the Avengers are now a United Nations Supervisory Committee, and there was a huge fight around it, and my dad got really hurt. And you and Thor really could have been helpful, so even though you two are fantastic, I'm still salty. While Bruce and Peter were talking, Valkyrie wandered off to the kitchen to get more chocolate milk. It sounds like I missed a lot then, Bruce said. Peter, what have you been telling him? Tony said as he and Thor walked back into the room. Not that much, I swear. Sure, I believe that, Tony said, smirking as he walked forward to clap his hand on Peter's shoulder. Thor has informed me that he left his brother in charge of a massive refugee ship, so we could probably let them get back there while I put in some calls to the UN. I don't want Loki getting any more ideas about world domination. Thor frowned. While my brother has indeed acted rashly in the past, I can assure you that... Yeah, I get it, Point Break. I was just joking. Tony turned and whispered to Peter. I wasn't joking. He looked back up at Thor. You should probably go check on your ship. It might take a while for me to arrange a meeting with the UN for you. When you do, call for Heimdall and he will alert me. Call for Eye in the Sky, got it. My companions and I will eagerly await your call, yes. Thor began walking towards his ship, gesturing for Bruce and Valkyrie to follow. Valkyrie walked past the group with the entire jug of chocolate milk in her hand, raising it towards Peter as she passed. Bruce took a few steps forward to follow Thor when Tony interjected. Bruce, you know you can stay here, right? The scientist looked at the ground and smiled a self-depreciating smile. I don't think I should stay here, Tony. I missed a lot, and I wasn't here when you needed me. Besides, someone has to keep an eye on Loki. Tony assessed his friend and nodded. Okay. Thanks for the offer, though. I guess I'll see you again soon. Say hi from me to everyone. Will do. Bruce nodded towards Peter. It was nice to meet you, Peter. You too, Peter exclaimed. They watched as the group of three boarded the ship, watched as the ramp closed and the craft took off, watched as it aimed towards the stars. Tony wrapped his arms around Peter, who reciprocated the hug. So, Tony said, what happened before I got here? Peter snorted. Bruce thought that I was you, but de-aged. What? Yeah.
The word I'm looking for. Bit 5. Carry On by TinyButFierce. 1. Peter was in the final year of high school when he received the news. Tony and Pepper were having a baby, and Peter wasn't allowed to tell anyone.
Peter went out anonymously at night all the time, and he had somehow managed to keep that a secret from everyone except... Okay, maybe he had revealed it to a bit too many people, but oh well. Anyways, apparently they were worried about security and the stocks and yada 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 adult things. Peter was personally of the opinion that they should have announced it immediately, but Pepper's glare had convinced him not to do it for them. About 5 months in, Tony revealed that Peter was going to have a sister. Then they sat down for a talk. Apparently, Tony thought that Peter was going to be jealous of his new sister, and Tony wanted to reassure him that, even though things wouldn't be the same, he still loved both of them equally. Peter didn't know why Tony would think that. Wasn't it obvious that Peter was excited? Besides, he was going off to college in a year. Things would have to change anyways. Peter sometimes seemed to be the one who was most excited about the baby. Tony just seemed nervous, and Pepper spent a lot of time throwing up. But at least, because it was Pepper, he threw up in an elegant fashion. When 9 months came along, Peter was one of the first people to see the baby. Morgan was awesome. As a gift, Peter got her a Spider-Man onesie and gave Pepper and Tony a coupon for his babysitting skills. He was an expensive hire, but for Morgan, the discount would be worth the cut to his profits. It took 2 months before Pepperoni had to go to a gala, and Peter was left alone with Morgan. Boy, did he have a plan. Friday and him had organised it over the course of a week, slowly buying the necessary items in quantities that Tony wouldn't notice. They had organised a fashion show. That's right, Peter had got multitudes of adorable baby outfits, and Morgan agreed, with various babbles, to be a willing participant. In the expanse of 3 hours, Morgan was a dragon, a penguin, a turkey, Princess Leia, Rutherford's model of an atom, and finally, Peter's favourite, Tony Stark. That's right, Peter had gone out and gotten a very small suit and a very small snazzy sunglasses. He also got a very small stick-on of the Tony Stark beard. It was amazing. Morgan did the exact same glare that Tony gave him all of the time, and the photo looked wonderful. He texted Pepper a photo and then went to the work of getting Morgan ready for bed. 2 minutes into that, he got a text from Tony. Tony, why is Pepper crying? Peter, she choked on her drink and now she's crying. Or maybe laughing. I can see that you texted her something, but she won't show me the screen. Peter, what did you do? I don't know what you're talking about. Tony, I don't believe that for a second. Peter, image sent. Look, it's you. Tony, I'm not sure whether to be proud or insulted. Pepper looked at me and started laughing again. People are staring. Tony ended up denying him babysitting privileges for a week, but Pepper reinstated him after she looked at the pictures again. Peter made it his phone background. Peter was aghast the first time that Morgan threw a Cheerio at him. Then he realised the potential. You see, Morgan was the perfect weapon for him to use in his perpetual war of Steve Rogers' torment. It only took a week for him to find an opportunity to enact his master plan. Tony had a meeting at the compound with a bunch of UN people, so Peter got to ride along in order to watch Morgan while Tony was doing the whole politics thing. Steve was perfectly placed in the living room, reading a book with his shield right next to him. Peter walked in and waved at Steve, Morgan perched in his other arm. Hey Peter, Steve said. How's college been treating you? It's been treating me. I'm on break right now. Hey, do you think you could watch Morgan for a second? And then, before Steve could have a moment to protest, he dropped Morgan down right next to the super soldier. He made a noise and batted her arms up and down. They stared at each other as Peter walked out the room and Friday pulled up a screen for him to watch the situation. Steve smiled awkwardly. Hello, kiddo. Morgan gurgled and reached for his shield. Steve quietly picked it up and put it next to her. While staring directly into Steve's eyes, she curled her hand around the outside and started chewing on the edge. Steve looked at her in silence. Morgan looked at Steve. Morgan continued to chew on Steve's shield. Peter almost died of laughter in the hallway outside. After he recovered a bit of his dignity, he decided to enact Phase 2. He ran back into the room with a bag of Cheerios. Oh, hey, sorry, I forgot. He paused. Is Morgan eating your shield? Yeah. Huh. Well, this should help. He handed Steve the bag. Let's give her some of these to eat and she'll stop doing that. I'll be back in a few. He ran out of the room again and turned on the screen. Steve pulled a Cheerio out of the bag and offered it to Morgan. She looked up and stopped chewing on the shield, reaching her hand out for the circle of oat. He put it in her hand and she looked at it for a second before pausing and throwing it at Steve. He gave her another Cheerio. He threw it again at him and gurgled. He sighed and tried again. This one hit him in the face. Tony walked past Peter in the hallway, who was on the ground laughing, and stepped into the room to see the aftermath. The floor was completely covered in Cheerios, a super soldier was on the edge of crying in frustration, and Morgan was happily chewing on Cap's shield. 3. Morgan was 5 years old when Tony retired from being Iron Man. After sustaining another injury in battle, his whole family sat him down and gave him an intervention. Somehow they managed to convince him, but Peter personally thought the only reason he stopped was due to Morgan walking into the intervention because of a nightmare. She requested juice pops, and Tony's smile said it all. A party was thrown in his honour, and everyone came. Everyone. Even people who they hadn't invited. Thaddeus Ross made his way into the party, and Peter was the first to notice his arrival. He looked for Tony and saw him by the edge of the lake, having a fun time speaking with Rhodey. So Peter decided to intervene. He grabbed Morgan, told her a few things, and pushed her towards Ross in order to cause chaos. She wandered over and stopped in front of him. He grimaced. Hello, child. My name's Morgan. I know, I've been keeping up to date with your father's activities. It's creepy. No, it's not. My brother says you're an asshole. Ross's face turned red. Now, young lady, don't call me a lady. That's not a good word to use. Morgan giggled. Sit. No, don't say. Peter walked over. Ross, did I just hear you teaching swear words to a 5-year-old? The general stammered. Absolutely not, I would never. Morgan tugged on Peter's sleeve. Sit. Peter gasped. Don't say that word. What did Dad say about that word? Only Mommy can use that word? Exactly. Peter turned back towards Ross. I don't think Tony will be very happy if he hears you teaching Morgan such language. You should get out of here. Ross stared at Peter before glancing down at Morgan, who smiled adorably at him. The general nodded. I'd best be going then. As he walked away, Morgan tugged on Peter's sleeve again. Juice pop. +1. So Peter bought a pet tarantula. Tony hated the thing and wouldn't even go near it, but Morgan thought it was cute. He seemed to think that everything fuzzy was cute, and honestly, so did Peter. It just so happened that Thor and Loki were visiting that weekend, and the two siblings saw it as a perfect opportunity. They put a little camera on Shelob, and Morgan went to go execute the plan with the spider cupped in her hands. She kicked Loki's door, which swung open to reveal the disgruntled mage. Morgan smiled. Hi, Mr. Loki. He sniffed. Thorn of Stark, aren't you too young to be wandering around by yourself? I'm 7. So you are. What do you want? She held her hand out. Pete was turned into a spider. Excuse me? She opened her hands. We didn't want to tell Dad. He would be mad. So, this creature here is your brother? Yeah, can you fix him? Loki frowned. Possibly. Morgan smiled and dropped the spider into Loki's hand. Okay, thanks, Mr. Loki. He skipped off. Peter and Morgan watched through Shelob's live stream as Loki stared at the spider for a solid hour. He tried a few spells, with no results, read a few books, that gave him no answers, and fed the spider a cricket, a relic of disgust. He finally threw his hands up in the air and scooted Shelob into a bucket. My apologies, son of Stark. It would be in your best interest to get used to this form. Friday split the screen so they could walk down the hallway, Tony sitting in the kitchen. Hey, reindeer games, Tony said. Loki placed the bucket on the counter and pushed it toward Tony. I'm afraid that I cannot fix your son. Tony blinked and looked into the bucket. That's a spider. Yes. Tony opened his mouth to speak right as Peter and Morgan walked into the room. The two adults stared at them. Peter waved. Hey, Dad. Hey, Mr. Loki. Morgan and I are here to make some sandwiches. Loki stared at the two and looked back down at the spider. Then, without saying anything, he turned and walked out of the room. Tony smirked as he realized what had happened. I'm so proud,